The long-legged young man named Bian Ziyuan slowly stood up and pointed at the deepest part of the karst cave. We'll be able to leave this sea area if we keep walking along the road ahead. Jian Wushuang did not answer him and sat up. Although his face was still pale, his immortal body had recovered more than half. There was no kindness without reason. Although Jian Wushuang was still unclear about the current situation, he could vaguely guess that the reason why he was here was related to this young man named Bian Ziyuan. However, since he was able to save him in front of those black-robed Grand Yen Immortals, he shouldn't have any ill intentions. Bian Ziyuan seemed to have noticed the coldness in Jian Wushuang's eyes, but he did not care. Instead, he continued, I found this underwater karst cave back then. It's extremely secretive. I'm afraid I'm the only Yen Immortal who knows about it. So please rest assured. Jian Wushuang nodded slightly. When he saw the old man squatting beside him, he was surprised. You didn't leave? The old man smiled bitterly. I saw that you were in trouble earlier, so I gritted my teeth and took you away. Who knew that my skills were inferior to yours? And then I fell into the bottom of the sea. Thank you for saving me. Jian Wushuang cupped his hands. He hurriedly waved his hand. No, I'm repaying my kindness. Didn't you spare my life earlier, sir? That's another matter. Thank you, Jian Wushuang replied. At this moment, Bian Ziyuan smiled slightly and said, The two of you, hurry up and hurry. Before they can react, let's leave this place first. That's the best policy. Jian Wushuang was still on guard against Bian Ziyuan, but the situation was just as he had said. He needed to leave as soon as possible. This cave had been formed at some point in time, and all the derived energy in it had crystallized, giving off a beautiful glow. If it was not under the sea, it would probably be a very good heavenly abode. Bian Ziyuan walked at the front, leading the way toward the deepest part of the karst cave. Out of caution, Jian Wushuang walked at the back and was on guard against any possible changes. The karst cave was long and there was nothing unusual about it. Just like Bian Ziyuan said, it seemed that other than him, no other Yen Immortals knew about this karst cave. The further he advanced, the purer the Yen power began to flow. Whether it was intentional or not, Bian Ziyuan started to get close to Jian Wushuang and walked side by side. His eyes were filled with curiosity. Finally, he said, I wonder if I can ask your name? Jian Wushuang glanced at him and said, Wushuang. Wushuang? Not bad. A cool name. Bian Ziyuan smiled and said, It's very similar to the name of an old friend of mine. Jian Wushuang did not answer. Jian Wushuang had already raised the highest vigilance in his heart towards these grand Yen Immortals who were exiled in the endless sea. They were not exiled for no reason. Even after countless years, it would be difficult to erase the resentment in their hearts. Brother Wushuang, you look very unfamiliar. Is this your first time in the heavenly continent? Bian Ziyuan asked softly as he led the way. Jian Wushuang nodded and replied, Yes, I'm looking for a companion. I won't stay here for long. Bian Ziyuan pondered for a moment. Companion? I think you're the only outsider in the heavenly continent. I'm afraid you'll have to return disappointed. Jian Wushuang said, That's fine. I can find him eventually. That might not be the case. Bian Ziyuan's expression was somewhat subtle. Brother Wushuang, you have to know that this endless sea has endless borders. Its contents are so vast that it can encompass the universe. Even us grand Yen Immortals can easily get lost in it. So I think that if you don't have a foothold, it's very likely that you'll get lost in this endless sea. Hearing this, Jian Wushuang nodded slightly and said, Thank you for telling me, but I don't intend to stay here. Then I wish you good luck. Bian Ziyuan shrugged and continued to lead the way. Due to their position, the old man gradually fell to the back of the group. At this moment, his expression was extremely anxious, as if he was waiting for something. The karst cave under the sky continent was extremely deep and long. Even though it was rich in yen power, it still made Jian Wushuang feel slightly uncomfortable. He was already prepared to deal with any unforeseen circumstances and released his sword essence at any time. However, nothing happened after that. The cave passage gradually went up without any changes. When Bian Ziyuan opened the end of the passage, the misty light from the outside world shone in. "Brother Wushuang, you're safe now." Bian Ziyuan laughed. Jian Wushuang heaved a sigh of relief. He cupped his hands and walked out. Stepping out of the karst cave tunnel, all he could see was the grayish-white land. There was not even the slightest bit of cover. At this moment, the old man who had been silent all this while quickly walked up to him and said in a low voice, "Sir, quickly follow me. I'll take you away from here." Jian Wushuang was a little confused, but he nodded in the end. "All right." The old man was overjoyed and hurriedly led the way. At this moment, Bian Ziyuan's lazy voice rang out. "Brother Wushuang, where are you going?" "Leaving this place," Jian Wushuang replied and turned around to leave. "If you want to leave with that old man, I can only say that you are stupid. Since you are so stupid, why don't you let me control your fate?" Bian Ziyuan's voice turned from lazy to cold. In the next moment, billions of berserk energy shot out, covering the entire sky. Jian Wushuang's heart tightened and he immediately released the ancestral skill, Transcendence Heavenly Gate. However, the towering gate had just appeared when it was actually destroyed by a huge palm that covered the sky. At this moment, Bian Ziyuan, who had a gentle gaze, was surrounded by a majestic force. The flowing clouds and water patterns on his naked chest were slowly flowing, filled with a force that could not be looked at directly. Jian Wushuang's gaze was solemn. Who would have thought that this unremarkable fellow, who did not even have much energy fluctuation, was actually a 6 revolutions grand immortal? An extremely mysterious light will appeared behind Bian Ziyuan's back. His eyes had already become incomparably black, and the flowing clouds and water patterns on his body were fluctuating. The old man who saw this scene was shocked and sat on the ground. He was extremely frightened. "I originally planned to spare your life, but rather than being killed by some trash, you might as well die in my hands," Bian Ziyuan said as he stretched out his palm to press down on Jian Wushuang. The boundless sky dimmed as a giant black palm that stretched for millions of feet descended. Jian Wushuang could not avoid the full-powered attack of a 6 revolutions grand yen immortal and could only face it. Immortal style, Little Mountain River. A 7-star galaxy slowly flowed between his eyebrows. If Jian Wushuang was confident that he could kill a grand immortal or even a 3 revolutions grand immortal, he had no chance of winning against a 6 revolutions. 6 revolutions was a dividing line for the grand yen immortal. Once one stepped into 6 revolutions, it would be a complete transformation, forming a light wheel of yen power. One's strength would increase by an unimaginable amount. This was also why Jian Wushuang could already kill a 3 revolutions grand immortal, but when he faced a 6 revolutions grand immortal beast, he fled. 6 revolutions grand yen immortals were nightmarish existences. However, he could no longer dodge and could only meet the attack head-on. The immortal-style Little Mountain River was summoned. High mountains and divine peaks rose from the ground with Jian Wushuang as the center. At the same time, a violent celestial river shot out from his palm, turning into a sky-splitting waterfall that slashed forward. The world was vast, and the most powerful attack erupted. The divine mountains stood tall, the celestial river surged, and the sea of stars flowed. Together, they constructed Jian Wushuang's immortal style. The most beautiful explosion completely exploded. Indescribable brilliance gathered at the center, like a million suns shining inside. It was extremely shocking. Even a yen immortal would not be able to survive in the center of this explosion. Bian Ziyuan, who was standing in the void, saw this scene. Although his expression was calm, his eyes were already replaced by shock. He could feel the terrifying power that Jian Wushuang emitted. It was because of this that he was surprised. Is there really such a terrifying yen immortal? Bian Ziyuan had witnessed the battle between Jian Wushuang and the 10 black-robed grand yen immortals. Therefore, he did not think that he could defeat Jian Wushuang. After releasing the sky-covering palm strike, he only stopped for a moment before his figure disappeared. In the middle of the unparalleled explosion, Jian Wushuang's body did not suffer too much of a blow. He quickly took out an emperor-grade pill and stuffed it into his mouth, ready to risk his life. Even though he had no chance of winning against a 6 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal, he was confident that even if he could not defeat him, he could still escape. The Immortal-style Little Mountain River, at its peak offset Bian Ziyuan's attack. Just as Jian Wushuang was about to make the first move, a great danger suddenly surged behind him. Shocked, Jian Wushuang turned around and kicked him without thinking. The old man with a sword in his hand did not even have time to react. He did not even have time to hide his ferocious expression before he was kicked away. Divine blood spurted out, and the old man fell heavily to the ground. His chest had caved in. The immortal body of the Grand Yen Immortal was unable to withstand Jian Wushuang's kick. Jian Wushuang was furious. "Why did you do that?" Spitting out another mouthful of divine blood, the old man was already extremely frightened and retreated repeatedly. Jian Wushuang was ready to kill him. However, at this moment, Bian Ziyuan appeared behind him like a ghost. Then, he quietly put his palm on Jian Wushuang's back. In an instant, countless energy beams shot out and bombarded the area. Jian Wushuang could not avoid it and his back took the hit. This terrifying strike was even heavier than the previous one. Caught off guard, Jian Wushuang spat out a mouthful of divine blood, and his arm that was exposed outside the mystic garb of the 9 heavens was shattered. Bian Ziyuan's attack was so terrifying that Jian Wushuang instantly lost the ability to fight. If not for the protection of the mystic garb of the 9 heavens, his immortal body would have shattered. Still not dead. Bian Ziyuan's eyes trembled, but he did not attack again. Instead, he let Jian Wushuang fall to the ground. Boom! He landed heavily on the ground. Divine blood flowed out of his broken immortal body. Drops of divine blood fell on the grayish-white ground and were swallowed directly. At the same time, gray tentacles rose from the ground and clung to Jian Wushuang's immortal body. These tentacles could devour the immortal body of a Grand Yen Immortal and were one of the main components of the heavenly continent. Then, Bian Ziyuan landed in front of Jian Wushuang with boundless power. He stomped his feet and the tentacles that were about to swallow Jian Wushuang drilled into the ground. Then, Bian Ziyuan slowly squatted down and looked at him with a regretful expression. "It's a pity for such a good seedling. I originally took pity on you, but I had no choice but to kill you myself. What a pity." His eyes were filled with pride and regret. Jian Wushuang's arm, which was exposed outside the mystic garb of the 9 heavens, had been shattered. He could not move at all and could only glare at Bian Ziyuan. Bian Ziyuan, who seemed to have lost his interest in killing, slowly stood up. He looked at the old man who was already in a daze and revealed a hint of disgust in his eyes. "You piece of trash. I've long seen that your heart isn't pure, so you hid your killing intent here," Bian Ziyuan said in disgust. He raised his palm and was about to hit the old man. At the same time, the loud sound of the morning bell and evening drum broke the silence of the sky and spread throughout the wilderness. Hearing the loud voice, Bian Ziyuan withdrew his palm and looked up at the center of the heavenly road. Then he picked up Jian Wushuang and rushed forward. As time passed, the undying and imperishable immortal body began to repair itself quickly. Jian Wushuang's limbs, which had been shattered, had already grown back. Bian Ziyuan, who was using his yen power to bind him, saw this scene and his eyelids twitched. From the strength of this guy's immortal body and his ability to adapt, he was actually a yen immortal? However, Bian Ziyuan did not think that he was a yen immortal. After all, how could there be a yen immortal who could kill close to 10 grand yen immortals by himself? "You'd better not move. Otherwise, I guarantee that you won't live to enter the imperial city," Bian Ziyuan warned with a solemn expression. Jian Wushuang was still in a weak state, bound by the yen power. He had no chance of winning against him, so he did not plan to fight. Piercing through the sky with Bian Ziyuan's 6 revolutions grand yen immortal strength, he reached the center of the entire heavenly continent plane in a few breaths. It was a huge city, a grand and strict city. However, none of the giant cities could exude such an ethereal and majestic aura. Could only be described as imperial city. In the entire heavenly continent, there was only one building that was extremely magnificent. After seeing this imperial city, Bian Ziyuan's expression became solemn. Then, he carried Jian Wushuang and entered the imperial city in an instant. Great heavenly official! In front of the grand door, there were 2-3 revolutions Grand Yen Immortals guarding. They cupped their hands and greeted Bian Ziyuan when they saw him. Bian Ziyuan nodded slightly, then directly carried Jian Wushuang, stepped through the imperial gate, and entered the strict imperial city. A supreme might came toward them. The supreme prestige was so cold that Jian Wushuang wondered what was living here. The so-called imperial city can be crowned with the word emperor. Could it be that an emperor lives here? Jian Wushuang was a little surprised, but he soon denied it. Even if Zhen Wuyang was extremely strong, he shouldn't be able to banish another emperor into the endless sea. Jian Wushuang was accompanied by the 3 imperial emperors' true shadows. They had fought with Zhen Wuyang until their emperor bodies were shattered, but they had not been captured. It could be seen that an emperor could be killed by another emperor, but they could not be captured or exiled. However, when the 2-3 revolutions Grand Yen Immortals guarding outside the emperor gate called Bian Ziyuan the great heavenly official, Jian Wushuang was still suspicious. The so-called heavenly official was a title that existed under the emperor's lineage. Only the emperor's lineage would have a heavenly official by his side. For example, Emperor Zhen Wuyang's faction, which controlled the entire Great Sea region. There were 7 princes under Zhen Wuyang, and each prince had 1 great heavenly official and 10 lesser heavenly officials. As for the emperor, there was only 1 great heavenly official, and there were no restrictions on the lesser heavenly officials. The importance of the position of great heavenly official was even more important than the great companion who had accompanied the emperor since he was young. This was enough to prove that the appearance of a great or lesser heavenly official meant the appearance of the emperor's lineage. This was because they only served the emperor and his son. Bian Ziyuan was known as the great heavenly official, which meant that there was a possibility that the imperial emperor's lineage existed in this imperial city. As Jian Wushuang thought about it, he could not help but feel a little solemn. Soon, everything that entered his eyes made him even more solemn. Countless immortal bones piled up and formed a path that reached the sky, extending into the unknown fog. At the end of the fog, the outline of a grand hall could be seen. The scene was so shocking that Jian Wushuang began to believe that there must be some terrifying existence living in it. Since you've already grown your limbs, then you should leave by yourself. I'll give you a piece of advice. Once you enter the imperial city, don't even think about escaping. Otherwise, these bones under your feet will be your end. Bian Ziyuan reminded Jian Wushuang coldly after he withdrew the yen power chain from Jian Wushuang's immortal body. Then, he walked to the front of the group and headed to the giant hall. Jian Wushuang turned his wrist and glanced at him coldly before looking around. The entire imperial city seemed to be shrouded in a mysterious cloud of smoke, giving off an unreal feeling. It was as if there was nothing real except the white bone road under their feet. After he calmed down, Jian Wushuang looked at the huge hall shrouded in smoke and walked forward slowly. The white bone path was 99,900 feet long. Jian Wushuang only looked at the huge hall with a complicated expression after he took the last step. The white bone path behind him was a total of 99,900 feet. Every foot was made of immortal bones, and every immortal bone was the corpse of a yen immortal without exception. In other words, just this white bone path was formed from countless corpses of the yen immortals. Where did this palace master come from? Why would he do such a shocking thing? There was also something strange that puzzled Jian Wushuang. There was a huge horizontal board in front of the huge hall in front of him. There were 3 big words engraved on the board. However, these 3 words were extremely strange, because no one could see the shape of the words from any direction. Since they could not distinguish the shape of the words, it was impossible to understand their meaning. However, Jian Wushuang soon realized that the strange words on the board were not written like this on purpose. Instead, they seemed to be reflected in the mirror. With this idea in mind, he quickly practiced it in his mind and then completely understood. The 3 strange words on the horizontal board of this awe-inspiring hall were actually reflected by the mirror. Jian Wushuang corrected the words in his mind and found the 3 words familiar. Zi Yen Palace. Standing in front of the door, Bian Ziyuan turned around and glanced at Jian Wushuang, who was still in a daze. Then he waved his hand and pushed the door open. It was as if the doors of the palace that had been sealed for countless years were slowly opened. A unique, ethereal fragrance floated out of the palace. Then Bian Ziyuan walked into the hall. As he entered, low moans came from both sides of the dark hall. "Greetings, great heavenly official." Although Jian Wushuang did not want to step into the hall, he had no choice but to step in. As he stepped in, the huge door behind him closed. The originally dim hall also lit up. On the pillars on both sides of the hall, nearly 100 sky lanterns slowly lit up. As the sky lanterns lit up, black-robed men began to walk out from both sides of the hall. Jian Wushuang's gaze was solemn. Each of the black-robed men who were walking towards him had at least the strength of a 3 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal. If he were to make a move, it would probably be extremely pessimistic. Looking at the approaching black-robed Grand Yen Immortals, he was already secretly channeling his yen power and preparing to fight. At this moment, Bian Ziyuan stopped in his tracks and slowly turned around. He said in a low voice, "Retreat!" As the voice fell, the black-robed Grand Yen Immortals who had surrounded Jian Wushuang retreated like a tide. After taking another glance at him, Bian Ziyuan continued to walk into the depths of the giant hall. Jian Wushuang heaved a sigh of relief. After looking around at the hidden danger, he did not stop and walked forward slowly. "Your Highness, I've already brought him to you." Bian Ziyuan stopped and bowed slightly as he spoke to the dark depths of the hall. "Ziyuan, you're here?" A weak voice sounded. Soon, a thin figure walked out from the depths of the hall in a hurry. "Ziyuan, is that you?" The thin figure was wearing a gray-white court robe. His face was like jade, but it was extremely pale. When Bian Ziyuan saw who it was, he nodded again. "Your Highness, it's me. I've brought him for you too." The young man who was addressed as His Highness looked at Jian Wushuang. For some reason, Jian Wushuang felt a sense of familiarity when he looked at him. "It's him. A mere Yen Immortal killed 7 Grand Yen Immortals that were under me?" The young man was in disbelief. Bian Ziyuan then said, "Your Highness, that's right. He was indeed the only one who crossed realms and killed Grand Yen Immortals. However, he did not just kill 7 but 11. "What is it? 11? The young man was shocked. "But he's clearly only a Yen Immortal." Bian Ziyuan's mouth twitched when he heard this. Indeed, such a battle record was too inconceivable for a Yen Immortal. Since the beginning of the ancient age, there had never been a case of a Yen Immortal being able to kill a Grand Yen Immortal. The difference between the two was comparable to the difference between a firefly and the moon. If Bian Ziyuan had not seen that scene with his own eyes, he probably would not have believed it even if he was beaten to death. A puny little Yen Immortal not only crossed levels to kill a Grand Yen Immortal, he even killed 11 without stopping. Facing the encirclement of 11 Grand Yen Immortals, even he himself would not be able to do it so easily. But the truth had already happened, so he had no choice but to believe it. Bian Ziyuan was already thinking about what would happen once Jian Wushuang broke through to the Yen Immortal stage and reached the Grand Yen Immortal stage. Then he nodded slightly and said, "Your Highness, that's true. All 11 Grand Yen Immortals died in his hands. Among them, the 6 black-robed envoys under you also died in his hands." The young man who was addressed as His Highness frowned and sized up Jian Wushuang with a serious look. He was a little uncomfortable being sized up by this kind of dignified gaze. The young man in front of him gave Jian Wushuang an inexplicable sense of familiarity, but he had no idea where this sense of familiarity came from. A moment later, he said in a cold voice, "In that case, did the 7 black-robed envoys under me really die in your hands?" Jian Wushuang did not hide anything and said calmly, "That's right, but they deserve to die. If they didn't come after me, I wouldn't have made them my enemies." "Then do you know why they are your enemies?" Bian Ziyuan turned around, looked at him and said coldly, "If you didn't intend to destroy the continent, why would they capture and try to kill you?" Jian Wushuang was speechless for a moment. In the bloody battle with the 4 Grand Yen Immortals, the land under his feet could not withstand the attacks and shattered. Then, Bian Ziyuan's voice softened. You have to know how difficult it is to establish a land area in the endless sea. Above the endless sea, nothing in the world can float. Even the Grand Yen Immortal can't travel through the sea for a long time. This is enough to show the importance of the heavenly continent. Once the heavenly continent is shattered, all the Grand Yen Immortals here will have no chance of escaping. Do you know how the heavenly continent was formed? Bian Ziyuan came to Jian Wushuang and said softly, "Every inch of land here was accumulated with the corpses of the Yen Immortals." Jian Wushuang raised his eyebrows slightly and secretly activated his Yen power in his palm. "All right, Ziyuan. Now I really want to see how he killed the 7 Grand Yen Immortals under me." The young man slowly walked out from the darkness and looked at him with a playful expression. Then he gently waved his hand. Suddenly, 3 black-robed envoys walked out from behind the mountain sea pillars on both sides of the huge hall and blocked Jian Wushuang's path. "Let's begin. Only if you can survive will you have the qualifications to continue the discussion." As soon as he finished speaking, the 3 black-robed men behind Jian Wushuang moved. At this moment, endless power was revealed. 2 at the initial stage and 1 at the 3 transformation stage. In an instant, the 3 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal was the first to move. Endless Yen power gathered in his palm and stabbed toward Jian Wushuang's back like the sharpest blade. At this moment, he also moved, but he did not turn around. Instead, he tilted his immortal body slightly and dodged that terrifying attack. While dodging, Jian Wushuang threw a punch to the side with all his strength. With the support of the selfless true shadow, this punch displayed 100% of its strength. The black-robed emissary, who had missed, was caught off guard and his entire body was hit by this punch. Boom! A huge force burst forth. How could the black-robed envoy withstand such a huge force? His entire immortal body was like a kite with a broken string, flying sideways and heavily smashing into the mountain sea pillar. The mountain sea pillars that supported each side of the hall were 1,000 feet thick. Normal Yen Immortals would not be able to destroy them. Rumble! The black-robed envoy smashed heavily into a mountain sea pillar. Countless cracks instantly covered the entire pillar with him as the center. It was likely that it would break in the next moment. Jian Wushuang did not stop after sending a 3 revolutions Grand Immortal flying. He turned around and smashed at the other 2 black-robed envoys. The unparalleled energy exploded in the hall. Waves of strong winds swept up, shaking the entire giant hall. Looking at the figure that was fighting fiercely with the 3 Grand Yen Immortals without being at a disadvantage, the young man and Bian Ziyuan were completely shocked at this moment. This scene was simply too shocking. One had to know that the Yen Immortal was merely a toy in the hands of the Grand Yen Immortal and could be killed with ease. There was simply no possibility of them fighting each other. However, Jian Wushuang's appearance had broken their inherent understanding. So a Yen Immortal could actually cross realms to kill a Grand Yen Immortal. 36,000 sword intents rushed out of his body and protected Jian Wushuang from being attacked. With the support of selfless true shadow, he was not afraid of 2 early-stage Grand Yen Immortals at all. He did not even acknowledge 3 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal. This was because the Grand Yen Immortals in the Endless Sea were more or less weakened. This was also the reason why Jian Wushuang dared to take a gamble. With a heavy punch, a slightly shorter Grand Yen Immortal was unable to dodge and was hit head-on. In an instant, his chest caved in, and his entire immortal body strangely folded in half from the middle. Then, he flew out like a cannonball and smashed into the mountain sea pillar. Rumble! The entire mountain sea pillar seemed to be unable to withstand such a huge force and directly broke apart from the middle. The huge hall shook, as if a corner of the hall was almost torn apart. After severely injuring the black-robed envoy, the pressure on Jian Wushuang's body was reduced and he was completely free to fight. Although Jian Wushuang was now completely free, he did not kill him. In this awe-inspiring giant hall, if he were to kill all the Grand Yen Immortals under him in front of the Palace Master, there would be no end to it. The giant hall shook and the unparalleled power exploded. With Jian Wushuang as the center, fine cracks appeared under his feet and gradually spread. The 2 black-robed envoys were sent flying. They got up from the ground and fought again. The mountain sea pillars were smashed into pieces, and the center of the hall was in a mess. The corners of the young man's eyes twitched when he saw this scene. Bian Ziyuan's initial shock turned into helplessness. He turned to look at the young man and said, "Your Highness, don't let them continue fighting. Otherwise, your palace will collapse. Quick, stop him." The young man finally spoke. Bian Ziyuan, who received the order, nodded his head. Then he took a step forward and casually waved his hand. In an instant, an endless amount of exquisite mist descended. As the exquisite mist descended, frost followed, freezing the battlefield in the giant hall. Jian Wushuang, who was fighting with the 2 grand yen immortals, felt the temperature around him drop sharply. It was as if he had fallen into an endless cold cave, which was extremely cold. The 2 grand yen immortals who were in the air were also frozen in the air at this moment. Jian Wushuang could not withstand the force and punched out. The 2 frozen grand yen immortals were directly blasted into countless ice crystals that scattered all over the ground. Ding, 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 the crisp ice crystals fell to the ground, and the giant hall fell into dead silence again. Out of the 3 grand yen immortals who had fought, only one was left, and it was unknown whether he was still alive or not. Jian Wushuang looked at Bian Ziyuan calmly as he threw the ice crystals off his palm. Bian Ziyuan's gaze was cold. He took a step forward and said in a deep voice, "Are you courting death?" He did not say anything. As he closed his palms, an invisible sword condensed. The originally silent hall was instantly filled with a murderous aura. "Do you think you can defeat me?" Bian Ziyuan took a step forward, and endless flowing clouds and water ripples appeared. At the same time, a light will condensed behind him. Just as the battle was about to begin, the young man spoke in a low voice. "My heavenly palace is not a place for you to fight, so all of you better restrain yourself. Otherwise, the foundation of this heavenly palace will be replaced by your immortal bodies." When Bian Ziyuan heard this, he withdrew his unprecedentedly powerful yen power and retreated behind him. Jian Wushuang put away his sword and looked at the young man who was walking towards him. "I'm really sorry about what happened today. I'll leave on my own and never step foot here again." "Leave? Leaving just like that? You killed nearly 10 of my black-robed envoys. How are we going to settle this score?" The young man looked at him with a faint smile and said, "Do you think I'll let you go so easily? What do you want to do?" Jian Wushuang looked at him and said. He smiled. "What I want is very simple. It's just a deal. Consider it as you paying me back." Hearing this, Jian Wushuang frowned slightly. He hated this kind of deal the most. It made him feel uncomfortable, as if his fate was controlled by someone else. "You only have one choice." The young man pointed a finger at him. As soon as he finished speaking, black-robed envoys began to walk out from the darkness on both sides of the giant hall. After pondering for a moment, Jian Wushuang said seriously, "What deal? This transaction is very simple, but you need to leave a place alive before I can tell you the terms of the transaction." The young man walked slowly to Jian Wushuang and said with a faint smile. Jian Wushuang felt an inexplicable sense of danger, but it was too late. A total of 40 black-robed envoys released their yen powers at this moment, bombarding the floor in the hall. In an instant, as if a sealed door had been opened, the entire floor was covered in blood-red ripples. "Good luck." The young man smiled strangely and pushed him down. Jian Wushuang was shocked. He wanted to resist, but the giant hall behind him had already turned into an endless sea of blood. A bloody palm grabbed him and dragged him into the sea of blood, disappearing. The blood waves surged, and everything returned to normal. At this moment, Bian Ziyuan came to the young man's side and asked, "Your Highness, are you planning to place all your hopes on him? Do you have any other way?" He had his hands behind his back as if he was thinking about something. "He gives me a very different feeling. I have a feeling that whether we can leave this endless sea will have a lot to do with him." "I hope so. We've been trapped here for far too long." Bian Ziyuan sighed softly as he looked at the churning sea of blood. "What if he is unable to pass the test of this blood sea? Then let him die inside. This blood sea is originally formed by the corpses of thousands of immortals. If he dies there, it really doesn't matter. Gush, the sound of water flowing like a clear spring could be heard. Jian Wushuang woke up almost as soon as he fell into the blood sea. He directly condensed an invisible sword and cut off all the blood chi arms that were wrapped around his immortal body. Everything was pure blood red. Unlike the endless sea of blood in the Sand Demon Cave, this sea of blood did not have the cold aura of death or the vicious coldness. Instead, it was filled with a dense restriction aura. This kind of restriction was very strange. It was filled with an ancient aura and gave people an unknown sense of security. Jian Wushuang swung his sword to cut off the bloody hand that was wrapped around his body and allowed his immortal body to fall slowly. He could feel that there was only endless death energy here. Other than that, there was no other threat. What exactly is this place? Why does it give me the feeling that it's a forbidden land? Jian Wushuang recalled in his mind and sized up everything in front of him. Soon, his figure sank into the deepest part of the blood sea. What surprised him was that the depths of the blood sea was actually land. It was indeed land, but it was made of white bones. The broken immortal bodies had already turned into piles of white bones. They piled up on top of each other and formed a boundless land of white bones. Standing under the blood sea, Jian Wushuang looked at the scene in shock. Even though he had a firm mind, he was still shocked. Just how many Yen immortals would have to fall to form this bone land? This was the confinement space under the blood sea. Above his head was the endless blood sea, and beneath his feet was the boundless land of white bones. In this endless world, he was the only one left alive, and it was extremely lonely. Why did he throw me under this sea of blood? After he calmed down, Jian Wushuang began to think about this question. This blood sea was boundless and filled with the aura of an ancient restriction. It was like an ancient battlefield left behind by an ancient battlefield, not an execution ground. Could it be that he wants me to obtain some kind of opportunity here? He thought of all kinds of possibilities. At this moment, along with the whimper of ice-cold wind, a cold and charming voice quietly sounded behind Jian Wushuang. Wushuang, look back and see who I am. Jian Wushuang turned his head abruptly and saw a figure in a black gold-pleated skirt. It was a woman. Her black and gold-pleated dress accentuated her figure, making her look luxurious and cold to the extreme. The distance between them was only a few feet, and they could clearly see each other's faces. At this moment, Jian Wushuang's eyes unconsciously focused together, and his heart beat faster. Facing such an extremely mysterious woman, he always felt that there was some kind of shackle in his heart. From the first time they met on the first voyage until now, they had only met a few times. Although they had only met a few times, they would always meet in unimaginable places. It was as if they were destined to never leave each other. The strong wind blew her long hair, and even her black and gold-pleated skirt was blown. It was like a blooming black and gold flower, making her unable to reach it. She was the only one on this white bone land. It's dry and cold, but it's fresh and gorgeous. She was Xianxia. Her long hair was blown away by the wind. Then, she took out a golden hairpin from her waist and tied her messy hair behind her. Her pretty eyes were filled with charm as she stared at Jian Wushuang. At this moment, even Jian Wushuang could not help but avoid her gaze. But for some reason, he could not avoid it and could only look at her. She was truly stunning, but she also carried an indescribable sense of danger. After the two of them looked at each other for a moment, Xianxia slowly walked toward him. Jian Wushuang wanted to retreat, but he found that his movements were a little unnatural. Tell me, why did you come here? Her tone was very unfriendly as she questioned him. Hearing the familiar tone, Jian Wushuang began to feel puzzled. Are you really Xianxia? It's not my imagination. Answer my question first. Xiangxia's tone was unquestionable, and her stunning face was faintly filled with anger. Jian Wushuang had no choice but to compromise. All right, I came here mainly because I want to find Di Qing. He has been exiled here. Then, he roughly told Xianxia everything that happened earlier. After listening to all of this, Xiangxia's brows furrowed slightly. Foolish. You risked your life here just for him? Do you know what this place is? Aren't you afraid of dying here? Jian Wushuang then said, I am 90% confident that I can find Di Qing and leave this place with him. However, if I really die here, I can only accept it. Idiot. Do you know that I am the calamity you are facing now? Zhang Ying looked at him and said coldly. Then, she suddenly pulled out a sharp soft sword from the jade belt at her waist. The tip of the sword was aimed at his throat. Jian Wushuang did not attack. He did not even release his yen power. He could feel that Zhang Ying did not have any killing intent. Similarly, she did not even release her yen power. Are you the real Zhang Ying or a fake Zhang Ying? He was completely confused and began to doubt. Zhang Ying withdrew the flexible sword in his hand and said coldly, Of course I'm fake. Jian Wushuang did not expect her to answer so straightforwardly. Taking back the flexible sword, Zhang Ying continued coldly. Remember every word I say. In this place, don't trust any of the Yen immortals. Just kill your way out. Who told you not to believe in any logic? He pondered for a moment before asking with uncertainty. Then should I believe what you said? Zhang Ying was silent. Finally, he said, Don't make me slap you. After saying that, she turned around and left. Remember every word I say. This will support you to survive here. Zhang Ying's figure finally disappeared in front of Jian Wushuang as if nothing had ever happened. But Jian Wushuang knew that she had indeed been here. Strange. Why does she always know where I am? Jian Wushuang stroked his chin and asked in confusion. At this point, he was certain that it was indeed Zhang Ying herself, although her appearance was a little too unbelievable. Jian Wushuang calmed himself down and thought about Zhang Ying's message again. Then he decided to set off. The land of bones under the sea of blood stretched endlessly. He guessed that if he wanted to leave, he had to keep moving forward. Since that's the case, I'll kill my way out. Jian Wushuang's gaze turned sharp at this moment. His entire immortal body was like a true sword that was waiting to be activated. As if following his thoughts, the originally silent white bone ground began to shake. As if it was boiling, the broken immortal bones began to recover. Supreme immortal aura? An extremely broken immortal bone lifted its sword and seemed to be attracted by the aura emitted by Jian Wushuang. Two balls of black light that were about to be extinguished surged in his eyes. I'm hungry. It suddenly raised the broken sword in its hand and rushed over like a madman. Jian Wushuang shook his head helplessly. In the next moment, an invisible sword condensed in his hand. Facing the skeleton army that was gradually gathering in front of him, he released his most powerful attack. Wushuang Sword Dao, Star River Lake Ocean Sword Intent. First move. Star. An ordinary slash fell like a stone thrown into a lake. Rumble. The endless power completely exploded at this moment. Millions of sword intents rose up from the sky, each one of them at the peak. As millions of sword intents surged, thousands of light pillars exploded. The white bone earth shook as if it was being destroyed. The skeleton army that was running wildly was directly shattered into powder under this sword strike. 100,000 white bones. 1 million sword intents. The mountains and seas were about to collapse, and even the heavenly Tao trembled under this sword strike. Countless white bones shattered into dust and fell back to the ground. A figure stepped on countless white bones and carried millions of sword intents as he moved forward firmly. At the same time, in the huge hall of the heavenly continent, the young man and Bian Ziyuan who were standing in front of the blood sea twitched their eyes when they saw this shocking scene. Especially when Jian Wushuang carried millions of sword intents and easily killed the skeleton army, it was a new scene. After a long while, the young man took a deep breath and said, Just where did this fellow come from? How could he be a Yen immortal? Bian Ziyuan shook his head and said, I know very little about him. I'm afraid no Yen immortal knows his origins. He's very mysterious. I'm afraid he will be able to complete this test very soon. The young man shook his head and said, Complete it? It's probably impossible to complete it. There's still an existence comparable to an emperor under the blood sea. You want him to obtain that person's inheritance? Bian Ziyuan's gaze was somewhat solemn. This isn't something he can obtain just because I want it. No one knows what that person means. My only hope now is that he can walk out of this alive. The young man said, perhaps when he comes out, we will know when we can leave this place. Swish! After the last sound of the sword slashing, there was no immortal bone left in front of Jian Wushuang. These immortal bones that had fallen for countless years had long been extremely fragile and were completely useless. If an ordinary Grand Yen Immortal had entered this place, they might have died. However, Jian Wushuang was different. These immortal bones could not even cause any effective harm to him. Every sword intent he released was enough to easily destroy any immortal bone. The millions of sword intents originated from the sword Dao, and they kept repeating endlessly. Even after killing all the immortal bones in front of him, he did not spend too much effort. This was a path of immortal bones. Who knew how many Yen immortals had fallen here to forge it? Although he had already revived the army of 100,000 immortal bones, Jian Wushuang knew that this was just the beginning. This blood river and white bone road hidden under the imperial city seemed to have not been opened for countless years. It was filled with an indescribable ancient restriction. Jian Wushuang stepped on the broken immortal bones under his feet and headed to the deepest part of the white bone path. Everything had just begun. In order to prevent any unexpected situations from happening, he directly let the sword intent flow around his body. Once danger approached, he could react immediately. Apart from the immortal bones that had lost their immortal charm, there were only broken treasures and true swords on the white bone path. They had been broken for countless years and had long since fallen asleep with their respective masters. The most well-preserved of these treasures were some true swords. They stabbed into the ground diagonally. Although their blades were no longer sharp, there was still a vast amount of power surging, as if they were waiting for a battle. The further he went, the more Jian Wushuang felt that something was amiss. The feeling of the ancient restriction became even stronger. At the same time, the white bones under his feet were very different from before. They had turned grayish-white. Jian Wushuang saw a strange scene after traveling another 1,000 feet. In the middle of the path of bones, a pile of bones made of countless white bones blocked the road ahead. There was no longer any immortal aura flowing in the grayish-white broken immortal bone, but it gave Jian Wushuang unprecedented pressure. He had a feeling that there was something dangerous hidden in this pile of bones. With his personality, he would not have moved forward, but the current situation forced him to. As soon as he stepped into the area of the pile of white bones, an extremely violent gale instantly erupted. In the next moment, the pile of white bones that was hundreds of thousands of feet tall shattered with a loud bang. A pitch-black arm that looked like a true dragon stretched out from it and smashed heavily toward Jian Wushuang. Jian Wushuang was shocked. Although everything happened too quickly, he had expected it. He crossed his arms and took the blow. Boom! He grunted and his immortal body flew back 1,000 feet. 2 deep ravines were dug into the ground of white bones by his legs before he stopped. Jian Wushuang held back the boiling blood in his immortal body and looked ahead solemnly. The pile of white bones that was tens of thousands of feet tall had already collapsed like a mountain. 2 pitch-black arms that looked like true dragons pushed away the countless white bones, gradually revealing their true appearance. Even Jian Wushuang was moved by the scene. Beneath the pile of bones sat a pitch-black figure that was as tall as a mountain. This pitch-black figure sat cross-legged in the middle of the white bone road. His entire body was pitch-black, and his chest was exposed. His stomach was big, and his face was round. His belly was especially huge, almost taking up 2/3 of his entire body, making it look like a fat Mithraea. His Zen clothes were already in tatters, and his fat face was glowing with a strange, oily light. 2 rays of red light shot out from his narrowed eyes. He looked at Jian Wushuang with greed. Then, something that made Jian Wushuang uncomfortable happened. Saliva dripped down from the pot-bellied Buddha's mouth like a waterfall, almost converging into a river. Then, he opened his palm and grabbed the immortal bones scattered on both sides, stuffing them into his mouth and chewing. A strange creaking sound echoed on the white bone path. Jian Wushuang frowned and quietly condensed an invisible sword. Hee. I haven't smelled the scent of a true immortal for a long time. The pot-bellied Buddha let out a strange laugh, and his saliva almost turned into a river. Let me take a small bite, just a small bite. I won't eat all of you, okay? Jian Wushuang did not want to waste his breath on him. He pointed the invisible sword forward. You can't kill me. Just let me have a small bite and I'll let you go. Okay? The pot-bellied Buddha said greedily. Die! Jian Wushuang said softly. In order to end the battle quickly, he directly used the ancestral skill. The reason why Jian Wushuang had not abandoned the ancestral skills was because they needed time to fully develop and bloom. They were not online yet. The current 2 ancestral skills were enough to match the immortal techniques. The ancestral skills, the Transcendence Heavenly Gate, and the Extreme Darkness Heavenly Gate were both released at this moment. 2 magnificent heavenly gates stretched across the top of pot-bellied Buddha's head. Then, a huge finger and a huge palm that reached the sky smashed down on his head with endless power. In the next moment, a wail rang out. The brilliant light emitted by the 2 ancestral skills directly enveloped him. Endless energy erupted on this white bone path. The pot-bellied Buddha's wails resounded in the surroundings. When the remnant power of the ancestral skills dissipated, a part of the pot-bellied Buddha's round and huge head had already collapsed. An unknown black liquid flowed out of his broken head. I want you dead. He was furious to the extreme, and a powerful suction force suddenly shot out from his huge mouth. Even Jian Wushuang, who was standing thousands of feet away, felt the suction force. He hurriedly waved his sword to cut off the terrible suction force. Seeing that he was not being sucked over, pot-bellied Buddha extended his tens of thousands of feet long arm and smashed it over. Every time he waved his arm, it was enough to shatter space. The ground of white bones continued to collapse as the huge arm smashed down. Jian Wushuang quickly dodged it. Such a powerful attack was enough to make ordinary Yen immortals die on the spot. With the invisible sword in hand, Jian Wushuang leaped thousands of feet in one step and landed on one of pot-bellied Buddha's arms. Hee. Come into my mouth. The pot-bellied Buddha opened his huge mouth and swallowed him whole. Jian Wushuang turned around and looked at the giant mouth. Then, he stabbed the true sword into the giant mouth's arm. Break! Jian Wushuang roared in a low voice. At this moment, millions of sword intents rushed into the arm of the pot-bellied Buddha along the sword blade. The sword intent was like a mountain and sea, exploding with a loud bang. In the next moment, the huge arm exploded from the middle, and endless sword intent poured out. With just one sword strike, one of the pot-bellied Buddha's arms was severed. The arm that was like a divine mountain fell and smashed heavily on the white bone road, stirring up dust. Jian Wushuang landed on the ground again and looked at the wailing pot-bellied Buddha. He was thinking about how to kill him quickly. Through this short exchange, Jian Wushuang vaguely guessed that he was most likely a 6 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal. It would not be easy to kill him completely. Bastard! I want you to die right here! The pot-bellied Buddha roared in rage. Having lost an arm, he was extremely furious. Then, he used his remaining arm to smash Jian Wushuang again. Space was torn apart and he quickly dodged. Looking at the pot-bellied Buddha who had lost his mind, Jian Wushuang thought of something and immediately raised his realm to the peak. Endless majestic divine patterns flowed around his body. The unknown power that surpassed the immortal evolution was extremely powerful. At this moment, Jian Wushuang was like a supreme true immortal, and all the heavenly Tao laws prostrated at his feet. Seeing this scene, even the arm of the pot-bellied Buddha hesitated for a moment. Jian Wushuang did not dodge. He just pointed at the front. Rumble! The two collided, and the arm that was like a true dragon was actually sealed in the air, unable to advance even an inch. A look of bewilderment flashed in the eyes of the pot-bellied Buddha. He realized that he really could not make a move. Then, Jian Wushuang said, "Let me go and I will spare your life. Otherwise, I can cut off one of your arms and destroy your immortal source." Destroy my immortal source, with your puny body? The pot-bellied Buddha cackled and shot a greedy gaze. It's not impossible to let you leave. As long as you let me bite you, I'll let you leave. Jian Wushuang snorted angrily and selfless true shadow appeared behind him. Jian Wushuang had already released the selfless true shadow in the void battleground in the Sixth Heaven realm. It was extremely mysterious. In an instant, the selfless true shadow, which was hundreds of thousands of feet tall, completely materialized. It was even 3,000 feet taller than the pot-bellied Buddha. Seeing this terrifying scene, the pot-bellied Buddha, who was still laughing strangely, was stunned. He even forgot what to do next. If you don't make way, I won't be polite. Jian Wushuang and the huge selfless true shadow behind him spoke at the same time. Boundless power spread out and it was extremely terrifying. Looking at the stunned pot-bellied Buddha, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He thought to himself that he had already intimidated him. However, in the next moment, the originally stunned Buddha suddenly laughed wildly. His remaining arm suddenly stopped the confronting selfless true shadow. At the same time, his extremely huge belly actually split open at this moment, revealing a Taoya's huge mouth that could almost devour the world. His entire stomach was actually a mouth. Jian Wushuang suddenly felt that something was wrong. He wanted to withdraw the true shadow, but he realized that it was too late. I want to swallow you all. After finishing his last sentence, the pot-bellied Buddha's huge belly suddenly opened up, revealing his big mouth and sucking at Jian Wushuang. Under this terrifying suction force, the 30,000-meter-tall selfless true shadow was completely unable to move at this moment. Cold sweat poured out of Jian Wushuang's temples. He had never thought that the pot-bellied Buddha would have such a trump card. Under this terrifying suction force, his immortal body was shaken. The 10,000-meter-tall selfless true shadow shattered, turning into countless stars that surged into the pot-bellied Buddha's incomparably huge belly. Not only did the selfless shadow disappear, but all the yen power in Jian Wushuang's immortal body was also disappearing rapidly. He turned pale with fright and instantly released his sword intent without holding back. Wushuang Sword Dao, Star River Lake Ocean Sword Intent. Second move. River. The majestic celestial river descended from the sky. This was a magnificent sword formed by billions of sword intents, carrying an intimidating force that could not be looked at directly. This sword was enough to suppress 100 yen immortals, causing the heavenly Tao to tremble. However, this magnificent sword move, which had always been successful, disappeared in the next moment. Rather than saying that it had disappeared, it would be more appropriate to say that it had been devoured. The majestic sword river was also swallowed by the terrifying suction force. Jian Wushuang was completely shocked. As his strongest sword principle, it had been disintegrated and absorbed. Who was this, the pot-bellied Buddha? As the selfless true shadow and the energy of the river-style sword intent were swallowed into his stomach, the pot-bellied Buddha's body expanded by tens of thousands of feet again. His entire stomach was about to explode, and it was extremely huge. You even want to swallow me? Aren't you afraid of bursting to death? Jian Wushuang struggled to stabilize his body and shouted angrily. Bursting? No one can fill me to death. I can swallow the heavens and the earth, he said with a strange smile, his face full of madness. Then I'll stuff you to death today. Jian Wushuang gritted his teeth and said coldly. In the next moment, his immortal body suddenly emitted billions of yen powers. This 100 million energy almost instantly swept through the white bone road behind him. At this moment, the true sword that was originally stabbed into the ground seemed to have received some kind of call. The silent sword edge suddenly appeared with a cold light. Cold light flashed. 10 cold lights. Thousands of cold lights. 10,000 cold lights. At this moment, all the dormant swords on the bone path were completely awakened. Each sword emitted a clear sword hum, as if they had been summoned by their master. Jian Wushuang stood in the void and raised his arms. As he raised his arms, tens of thousands of cold lights burst out, and tens of thousands of true swords rose into the sky. They hung high behind Jian Wushuang and emitted endless power. At this moment, he was like the ruler of the sword, the sovereign of all swords. Where the sword pointed was the journey. Go! Jian Wushuang waved his hand and tens of thousands of swords exploded with their own magnificent power. They seemed to be able to sense that this was the last moment they could unleash, so the endless sword intent was simply magnificent to the extreme at this moment. It was as if they had returned to the day before they fought alongside their master, and they let out excited sword cries. Then they charged at the pot-bellied Buddha together. Dominating sword intent lit up the entire White Bone Road. At this moment, Jian Wushuang became serious. Swords had souls. They were connected to their masters and could even resonate with their souls. At this moment, they were all willing to release their peak sword moves to show Jian Wushuang. After the peak, it was the end. When the sword intent reached its peak, all the true swords shattered. They were all shattered into powder, and there was no way to repair them. No, don't. The sword intent was like the mountains and seas that were about to collapse, directly engulfing and concealing the pot-bellied Buddha. 10,000 sword intents finally bloomed without reservation. The white bone path stirred up dust, and even the blood river above their heads fluctuated, as if it could pour down at any time. Jian Wushuang remained rooted to the ground. His eyes were fluctuating, but he finally calmed down. He looked at the place where the tens of thousands of sword intents were blooming and knew in his heart that there was no chance of the pot-bellied Buddha surviving. When all the sword intents dissipated into dust, falling onto the white bone path, Jian Wushuang saw a miserable scene. The divine mountain-like immortal body of the pot-bellied Buddha had already been shattered by the tens of thousands of sword intents. The endless divine blood almost formed a river on the bone road. Everything in sight was filled with sorrow. Jian Wushuang borrowed the strength to fight back and awakened all the sword intents on the white bone path. That was why he could defeat the 6 revolutions great Immortal so easily. Otherwise, it would be almost impossible to defeat him. Looking at the immortal corpses on the ground, Jian Wushuang collected his thoughts and prepared to leave. However, at this moment he felt a weak aura. Although the aura was weak, it was real and extremely familiar. Jian Wushuang was slightly shocked and looked in that direction. He saw a miserable figure struggling among the countless huge immortal corpses. Impossible! Why isn't he dead yet? As he thought of this, he hurried back to the remains of the pot-bellied Buddha. He waved his palm to blow away the huge immortal corpse, and an extremely skinny figure covered in blood entered his eyes. Cough, cough. I'm finally free. The extremely skinny figure lay on the white bone path soaked in divine blood. A voice that sounded like a heavy burden came from his mouth. Jian Wushuang frowned slightly. From the clothes on the figure, he could see that it was a tattered Zen robe. Moreover, there was a string of huge Zen pearls hanging around his neck. Jian Wushuang had seen this kind of attire once in the Great Yen domain. Even the group of monks who destroyed the heavenly region where the Sand Demon Cave was located were dressed like this. He knew very little about the origin of those monks. He only knew that they came from beyond the Great Sea region and were extremely terrifying existences. Many monks had entered the Sand Demon Cave, but only Kong Luan had left the deepest impression on Jian Wushuang. This skinny figure seemed to be related to the group of monks from a long time ago. Could it be that he also came from the so-called heaven-reaching Buddhist realm? Jian Wushuang thought to himself and formed an invisible sword in his hand. Cough, cough. The emaciated figure opened his mouth and spat out a large mouthful of divine blood, then collapsed on the ground. It was only then that Jian Wushuang saw his face clearly. He was thin and skinny like an ascetic monk. Their eyes met. The monk, who was already on the verge of death, suddenly used all his strength to get up and kneel down in front of him. Thank you. You're a good man for giving me freedom, and Xingge could not repay you. Jian Wushuang did not reply. He stared at him without relaxing. Finally, he said slowly, "Where did you come from? Why are you here?" The monk who called himself Xingge coughed lightly and sat cross-legged on the white bone path. He put his palms together and said, "Since you asked, Xingge will tell you the reason. I'm a monk from the heaven-reaching Buddhist realm. I'm an ascetic monk who travels in the myriad worlds and experience all kinds of suffering." Jian Wushuang's divine thoughts were shaken when he heard this. Just as he had expected, the monk was from the heaven-reaching Buddhist realm. The monk named Xingge continued to talk to himself, And the reason why I'm here is purely because of that battle. That was the battle to destroy the old era and build the new heavenly court. All the living beings died in that battle, and the heavenly regions that were subordinate to the old heavenly court also died. Not only did the heavenly regions fall, even the experts within died. However, the experts died, but the supreme experts were not killed. Those utmost powerful beings were all exiled to a place that has no form or form. As for that place, it's here. Xinggu said as he pointed at the ground with his skinny hand. I traveled to that place, which is the Great Sea region. I was unintentionally dragged into that war, and was eventually exiled here for various reasons. When Jian Wushuang heard this, he asked again, then why did you become like that? When Xinggu heard this, 2 lines of tears flowed out of his dry eyes. Finally, he said, greed. I relied on myself to get rid of the 6 desires, but I couldn't escape the control of greed in the end. After I was exiled here, my mind was injured and then I was invaded by the Yen Immortals. It aroused the final greed in my heart and turned me into an evil Buddha. If it wasn't for the good people who came here and destroyed my evil body, I'm afraid I would be trapped here forever. The short conversation came to an end and Jian Wushuang learned some secrets from Xing Ji's words. These grand Yen Immortals who were exiled to the Endless Sea were all supreme experts of the old heavenly court before Zhen Wuyang established his own heavenly court. This was somewhat different from what Jian Wushuang had guessed. He thought that those who were exiled here were some extremely evil grand Yen Immortals. Xinggu put his palms together, his dead eyes filled with relief. Thank you, Samaritan. Xinggu has been freed, but before he is freed, I would like to give you something. As he spoke, his skinny palm touched the string of ring beads around his neck, and then he took off the fist-sized ring bead in the middle. In an instant, all the ring beads around his neck turned into nothingness. Only the one in his hand emitted a mysterious color. Seeing such a ring bead, Jian Wushuang thought of something else. In the blood sea of the Sand Demon Cave, he had visited Kong Luan, and Kong Luan had given him a bead of life. Samaritan, Xinggu has nothing to repay you with, so I'll give this ring bead to you. Jian Wushuang did not refuse. After pondering for a while, he reached out and took the bead from his hand. The ring bead was warm and cool in his hand, and had a unique texture. Then, Jian Wushuang said, do you know of an ascetic monk called Kong Luan? Xinggu, who was about to die, opened his eyes wide when he heard this name. Kong Luan? My junior brother, his name is Kong Luan. Have you seen him before? Is he doing well? Jian Wushuang sighed in his heart and then said slowly, we met once before. We sat together for a few days and hit it off. He was also an ascetic monk who measured the earth with his feet. However, I'm afraid he has passed away. Xing Ji's entire body trembled, and 2 streams of tears flowed down his eyes again. He did not make any excessive moves. A moment later, he said in a low voice, forget it. Forget it. It's time for me to do so. As the sound of his voice faded, the withered immortal body disappeared into nothingness. Stars flowed out and eventually scattered on the white bone path. A 6 revolutions grand evolution immortal died just like that. Jian Wushuang was silent. He looked at the dark ring bead in his hand and threw it into the Boyang bottle. Xing Ji's death did not affect him too much. What he was thinking about now was how to quickly leave this white bone path. This place was not as quiet as he had imagined. A 6 revolutions grand Yen Immortal might just be the beginning. The most mysterious existence of the white bone path was probably up ahead. With the death of pot-bellied Buddha and Xing Ji's passing, the white bone path became unobstructed again and Jian Wushuang could see the road ahead. He collected his thoughts and continued to walk forward with determination. The path of bones was endless, but the path under his feet had an end. Jian Wushuang's feet stepped on the sword intent and traversed millions of miles. Under the blood sea and on the white bone path, no Yen Immortal could stop him. After leaving the original pot-bellied Buddha's domain, the evil and greedy feeling on the white bone path ahead disappeared. Instead, the aura of the ancient restriction surged, filled with the unknown. At the same time, The white bone path under their feet began to turn grayish-black, and most of the scattered immortal bones were intact, as if they were asleep and could wake up at any time. Jian Wushuang became alert. At the same time, he restrained the overflowing yen power and moved forward with the sword intent around him. A cold aura quietly surged from his body. It was very unfamiliar and somewhat familiar. In the next moment, an extremely cold light suddenly bloomed from the white bone path and shot straight at Jian Wushuang. He was already on guard. He opened his fingers and shot out a beam of energy. Boom! The light of the yen power destroyed the extremely cold light and blasted towards the white bone path, directly raising a huge wave of dust. It was a pitch-black immortal bone holding a true sword. As Jian Wushuang destroyed him, he did not stop and shot forward. However, everything changed. As he moved forward, the 10,000 feet long dust wave slowly came to an end, and then countless dark red death rays burst out. The immortal bones lying on the white bone path were all revived at this moment. Their empty eyes were now replaced by dark red death rays. Kill! At the forefront of the skeleton army, there was a white skeleton that looked like a divine mountain. It was hundreds of feet tall. He held a broken true sword and pointed it at Jian Wushuang. In the next moment, the skeleton army swarmed forward, looking extremely terrifying. Jian Wushuang knew that something was wrong. Looking at the skeleton army behind him, he realized something. This new round of bones brought with it an extremely thick death aura, which was exactly the same as the Death Immortal in the Death Immortal heavenly region where Yuyun was. They barely retained some of their consciousness. They were extremely eager for the power of the Yen Immortal. Their bodies still had the immortal source that was about to shatter. Their strength could not be underestimated, and it was extremely troublesome. At present, the army of Death Immortals was endless. If Jian Wushuang didn't escape as soon as possible, he would be surrounded. However, the energy released by these Death Immortals was still far beyond his imagination. Almost at the same time, the army of Death Immortals, which still had their own immortal sources, surrounded Jian Wushuang from all directions. Damn it! What are these things? He was shocked, and at the same time he released a million sword intents without hesitation. But what surprised him was yet to come. These Death Immortals who were chasing after him would actually dodge the sword intent instead of being slaughtered. For a moment, the million sword intents had little effect. They could barely stop the attack for a while. After killing thousands of Death Immortals, he could no longer stop the attack. Buzz! Along with a strange sound, dark red light beams rushed out from the bone palms of each Death Immortal and formed a spider web-like net that pressed down on Jian Wushuang. Space seemed to have frozen. He could not escape and was instantly suppressed by the inescapable net. At the same time, the army of Death Immortals surrounded Jian Wushuang. Clack! Accompanied by the sound of stiff bones twisting, the army of Death Immortals automatically made way for him. Then, a huge immortal bone that was hundreds of feet tall walked toward Jian Wushuang. It was filled with boundless power and was extremely terrifying. Their eyes met, and the huge skeleton of the Death Immortal raised the broken sword in its hand, pointing the tip of the sword at him. "I want to fight you." A hoarse and ethereal voice rang out from the mouth of the huge Death Immortal skeleton. Jian Wushuang looked at him and formed an invisible sword without saying a word. "If you lose, your immortal source will be mine, and your soul will become my slave," the Death Immortal skeleton said in a deep voice. Then he stretched out his palm, tore open the inescapable net, and walked in. Jian Wushuang was not careless when facing the Death Immortal who was hundreds of feet tall and looked like a divine mountain. Even though a Death Immortal was half a level weaker than a Yen Immortal, this huge corpse of a Death Immortal did not look like an ordinary Yen Immortal. Although he was also a skeleton, outside of the skeleton, there were billions of energy threads. He did not look much different from an ordinary immortal body. When another dark red yen power will appeared behind him, Jian Wushuang knew that something was wrong. The light will formed. It was at the 6 revolution stage. Once he stepped into 6 revolutions, the Grand Yen Immortal would reach the peak. Even though Jian Wushuang could fight a Grand Yen Immortal, he could only flee when facing a 6 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal. As the Death Immortal skeleton revealed its strength, Jian Wushuang could not avoid it. The invisible sword in his hand pointed forward. "Little Yen Immortal, you overestimate yourself." The corpse of the Death Immortal roared angrily. Then he directly attacked. The broken sword in his hand suddenly stabbed into the white bone path on the ground. Then, the extremely violent sword intent tore the white bone path apart and rushed toward Jian Wushuang like several dormant dragons. The white bone path was broken into pieces, and a huge wave of dust rose. Seeing this, Jian Wushuang suddenly jumped into the air, raised the invisible sword in his hand, and pressed down heavily. 10 sword intents that carried thousands of immortal bones surged up and met the attack. When the two collided, the entire white bone path shook. The giant corpse of the Death Immortal wielding the true sword was forced back a few steps by the tremendous force. An unparalleled light shattered the sword intent that was carrying the immortal bone from head to toe. Then Jian Wushuang landed on the ground. His robe was not stained by any dust. The light in the Death Immortal skeleton's eye sockets flickered twice. Then he raised his true sword and dashed toward Jian Wushuang. The white bone path shook. Shiyan's heart skipped a beat. In the fight just now, he could feel that although the skeleton of the Death Immortal could still form the Yen power wheel, its strength had already declined to the extreme. The current Death Immortal skeleton only had 3 revolutions strength at most. After sensing the change, Jian Wushuang decided to end the battle quickly. With a wave of his hand, the ancestral skill Transcendence Heavenly Gate condensed. Then, a giant finger reached straight for the Death Immortal skeleton. Seeing the brilliant light blooming above his head, the Death Immortal skeleton raised the sword in its hand and stabbed it. Boom! The giant finger was directly smashed into pieces. As countless tassels fell, they blocked all vision. "Now!" Jian Wushuang shouted, and his body turned into a blue sword light, stabbing forward. Everything happened too quickly. When the huge Death Immortal skeleton came back to its senses, Jian Wushuang, who had transformed into a sword light, had already arrived in front of it quietly. With a cold glint in his eyes, the invisible sword in Jian Wushuang's hand released its power, and the tip of the sword stabbed forward. In the center was the immortal source of the dead immortal skeleton. As long as the invisible sword could pierce through, Jian Wushuang would be able to release millions of sword intents in an instant and completely shatter it. But in the next moment, something unexpected happened. When the tip of the sword was only an inch away from the immortal source of the Death Immortal skeleton, 2 huge white bone fingers grabbed the blade of his sword and sent him flying. Jian Wushuang was surprised when he retreated a few hundred feet. He did not expect the Death Immortal skeleton to react so quickly. After forcing him to retreat, the skeleton of the Death Immortal let out a low groan and slashed forward again. Facing the huge broken sword blade, Jian Wushuang also raised his sword to deal with it. Clang! Clang! The sword intent surged, and millions of sword intents surged. The white bone road shook and once again stirred up a huge wave of dust. The sound of metal clashing resounded throughout the entire bone road. The army of Death Immortals surrounding the inescapable net all waved their swords and let out earth-shaking roars. K-Kill dash at this moment, Jian Wushuang, who was fighting with the Death Immortal skeleton, was even more shocked. Faced with the sword intent that was faster than the previous one, the skeleton of the dead immortal, which was as huge as a divine mountain, did not feel heavy at all. Instead, it became lighter and lighter. He was able to withstand Jian Wushuang's sword intent with ease. This was not a reaction that a Yen immortal who had never come into contact with sword Dao would have. At this moment, Jian Wushuang was puzzled. Could it be that this 6 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal also cultivated sword Dao when he was alive? The battle continued. If he did not release his Wushuang sword Dao, Jian Wushuang would not be able to do anything to him. Just as Jian Wushuang was about to release the Wushuang sword Dao, the Death Immortal skeleton suddenly opened its mouth. "Are you a swordsman?" The hoarse voice was like a big palm that plucked the string in Jian Wushuang's heart. "Are you a swordsman too?" he asked. There was no answer, but the face of the Death Immortal skeleton put on an unknown expression. "I didn't expect to meet a living swordsman in this sealed land. Before I was exiled in my long life, there were less than 10 yen immortals who could be called swordsmen. Now that I have seen a true swordsman, the heavenly Tao has treated me well. He forced Jian Wushuang to retreat and stood still. I'm also a swordsman, but that was a long time ago. You're one of the few people I call a swordsman. Jian Wushuang did not comment on it, but the invisible sword in his hand was still ready. Now let's use the swordsman's method to solve this. Perhaps the opportunity for me to break through to the sword immortal realm will appear by fighting you. As the death immortal skeleton spoke, it pressed down the broken true sword in its hand and pointed the blade at Jian Wushuang. Hearing his last sentence, Jian Wushuang's lips curled up and he said loudly, "You still have a long way to go to become a sword immortal. It's like a natural moat. Then there are only two paths for me to take today. I will break through to become a sword immortal, or I will be killed by you." The skeleton of the death immortal said in a deep voice. The true sword in its hand slashed down heavily at this moment. The white bone road beneath his feet was also plowed open by this attack. "Sword of the great celestial river," he said in a deep and angry voice. At this moment, the broken blade exploded with the most dazzling sword. A magnificent light surged out of his true sword. The space was suppressed, and the inescapable net was shattered by this sword move. Jian Wushuang felt the pressure, like a divine mountain was pressing on him. This sword move was enough proof of a true swordsman. Jian Wushuang's eyes were solemn and the invisible sword in his hand was shining. The second move of the unparalleled sword Dao's Star River Lake Sea Sword Intent. River. The majestic celestial river came from the sky, breaking through the void and arriving. Billions of sword intents formed the celestial river, and it was extremely magnificent. At this moment, the two celestial rivers collided, creating the most magnificent scene on the white bone path. When the army of death immortals who had been surrounding the area saw this scene, they all retreated crazily with tacit understanding. However, it was too late. The two celestial rivers collided, and the terrifying power that erupted swept everything away. Some of the death immortals who were slower were turned into dust on the spot. Under the illumination of this sword light, the death immortal skeleton subconsciously covered its eyes, and then its body was swallowed by the sword light. At this moment, the boundless sword intent replaced the yen power and devoured everything. The clash of sword intents lasted for a long time. It was not until the white bone road was reduced to dust that the sword of the great celestial river came to an end. The waves of dust returned to silence, and all things returned to dust. Jian Wushuang appeared on the path of broken bones that was covered in immortal bone dust. Under the white dust that filled the sky, only his black clothes were not stained by any dust. In front of him, 100 feet away, stood the corpse of a death immortal that was hundreds of feet tall. The broken true sword in his hand finally shattered completely. Not even the hilt was left behind, and his pupils were dim and silent. "You shattered my sword, Dao." "Yes, but that's all I can do," Jian Wushuang said slowly, his eyes flickering. "Was that the true sword Dao just now?" The death immortal skeleton stared at him, trying to find an answer. Jian Wushuang did not hide anything and said, "That's my sword Dao, the sword principle that I comprehended. I didn't expect that I could fight a true swordsman in this state." "I'm already satisfied," the skeleton said. "You're not a swordsman." Jian Wushuang did not say anything. He did not need others to judge whether he was a swordsman or not. "You've already surpassed the realm of swordsmen. You're a sword immortal. I have no regrets to be able to watch a sword immortal's sword moves." Jian Wushuang raised his eyebrows slightly. This did not sound like something an extremely proud Six Revolutions Grand Yen Immortal would say. After the skeleton finished speaking, it seemed to be satisfied. The flowing immortal source in its immortal body also quietly shattered at this moment. He did not want his immortal source to break. In the previous fight, Jian Wushuang's sword strike was aimed at the immortal source of the death immortal skeleton. Once the immortal source was broken, even a Grand Yen Immortal could only die, and the skeleton of a death immortal who had died once was no exception. As the immortal source shattered, the skeleton of the death immortal kneeled heavily on the broken white bone path. Its huge bone palm waved in the air, as if it wanted to keep the disappearing immortal source. Jian Wushuang, who was standing in front of him, looked at the scene calmly and then dispersed the invisible sword in his hand. "I am going to die," the death immortal skeleton murmured softly. However, when the death light in its eyes was about to die out, it suddenly lit up again, as if it was the last ray of light. "Although you are a sword immortal, there are more sword immortals on this path. I look forward to your battle, but I can't watch it anymore. Their sword Dao is even stronger than yours. You won't win so easily." After saying that, the skeleton of the death immortal completely fell like a broken divine mountain. His immortal bones were completely shattered into powder and could no longer be revived. Standing on the slowly healing white bone path, Jian Wushuang was silent. Although his expression was calm, his heart was already trembling. There were actually sword immortals on the path of bones. This news shocked Jian Wushuang more than any other news. To be fair, a sword immortal was an existence that was simply unimaginable. To Jian Wushuang's knowledge, only Ding Bai could be called a real sword immortal. Even Jian Wushuang himself did not recognize himself as a sword immortal. He had a feeling that he could only fight Ding Bai after he had integrated the last move of the Wushuang sword Dao. At that time, he could be called a sword immortal. And right now, a Grand Yen immortal who could be called a sword immortal by the corpse of a death immortal was definitely a terrifying existence. Jian Wushuang felt a headache coming on. What kind of terrifying existence was trapped on this white bone path? Just as he was deep in thought, the death immortals who had disappeared quietly revived at this moment. Dark red beams of death shot out from their eyes. Damn it! Haven't these things been dispersed? Jian Wushuang was shocked, and then he ran away without thinking. Although he was not afraid of the army of death immortals, it was still a mistake to waste his energy. Therefore, in the following time, a figure could be seen running wildly, and behind him was an endless army of death immortals. The white bone path was endless, and as they continued forward, it became wider and more vast. It was like an ancient battlefield that had experienced a tragic and bloody battle. There were broken immortal bones everywhere, treasures without spirituality, and broken true swords. It was extremely miserable. Jian Wushuang, who had been moving at high speed, looked at the approaching army of death immortals and could not help but feel angry. Just as he was about to destroy everything, the white bone path beneath him trembled as if something was awakening. "Disturbing my long slumber. I think you little bugs are really tired of living." A lazy and slightly angry voice seemed to resound from the heavens. The next moment, the clear sound of a long sword being unsheathed echoed across the battlefield of bones. Along with the clear sound of the long sword being unsheathed, the death immortal army that was chasing after Jian Wushuang frantically fled. However, it was too late. The sword curtain rose silently like a million meteors falling, causing the entire dark red void to tremble. The endless void and the hundreds of millions of miles of white bone path were all covered by the sword curtain. Every sword intent that formed the sword screen was filled with a calm and endless will. Although it seemed peaceful, it made everything lose its color. Under the cover of the meteor-like sword curtain, none of the death immortals survived. They died so easily that Jian Wushuang could not believe it. The final desolation of the endless sword intent shattered all the death immortals. On the ancient battlefield, dust filled the air. Jian Wushuang, who was in the center of the sword curtain, did not feel any fluctuation. This ability to control the sword intent was extremely terrifying. Jian Wushuang stood rooted to the ground, ready to condense sword intent in his palm. However, at the same time, a cold aura appeared behind him. "Hey, Junior, don't try to draw your sword. Your speed will never be faster than mine. If you don't believe me, you can try." Cold sweat flowed down from Jian Wushuang's temples. The fact that this person could sneak behind him without a sound was enough to explain the problem. Immediately after, a layer of ripples appeared in the originally silent void, and then a figure walked out of the ripples. Jian Wushuang opened his eyes wide. It was a woman with an extremely heroic spirit. Her long and narrow willow-like eyebrows slanted into her temples, and her handsome eyes were extremely attractive. The embroidered red belt that tied her long hair behind her back also fluttered in the wind. She was wearing a black and gold dress, and at her waist were 6 long swords. This was a swordsman. She walked down from the void and stood on the ancient battlefield. She looked at Jian Wushuang with her extremely heroic eyes, revealing a thought-provoking expression. Looking at the 6 long swords hanging at her waist, Jian Wushuang could not help but swallow. There was a tiger in front and a wolf behind. He was in danger today. As time passed, Jian Wushuang did not dare to move. After a long while, the heroic woman with 6 swords on her back suddenly said, "This junior is not bad." Immediately after, the mysterious figure behind him also spoke, "Indeed, not bad. His willpower is extremely stable. He's a great talent." When the heroic woman heard this, her eyes twitched and she said coldly, "Since he's a big shot, why are you still squatting behind him? Are you going to kill him?" As soon as she finished speaking, the dense aura behind Jian Wushuang disappeared. Then, a figure appeared in front of the heroic woman in an instant. "No, I'm just used to it. I can't bear to kill a junior with such talent. There's great use in keeping him." At this moment, Jian Wushuang saw the figure. It was also a handsome middle-aged man. He had a clean face and no beard. His eyes were bright like stars, but there was a hint of laziness in them. On his waist there were also 6 long swords. The middle-aged man could not hide the smile on his face as he faced the heroic-looking woman. "It can't be. These 2 swordsmen can't be sword companions, right?" Jian Wushuang felt a headache coming on. It seemed that the 2 swordsmen were indeed sword companions. He was afraid that it would not be so easy for him to escape from this place. "This junior is indeed not bad. I saw his sword Dao earlier. It was very shocking. He could destroy a 6 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal's immortal source," the heroic-looking woman said slowly. After the middle-aged man heard her description, the smile on his face gradually disappeared and he became extremely solemn. How strong was a sword Dao that could destroy the immortal source of a 6 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal? And how strong was the guy who could use this sword Dao? In other words, the one who caused the commotion on the White Bone Path was this junior? The middle-aged man asked slowly. The heroic-looking woman nodded. "That's right. I happened to witness that battle. It was exciting enough. If it really is him, it seems that I woke up at the right time." The middle-aged man looked at Jian Wushuang and smiled. Jian Wushuang felt a chill down his spine. He could feel that although the 2 sword companions did not reveal any strength, they were definitely more terrifying than a 6 revolutions Grand Yen Immortal. Thinking of this, he suddenly realized something. The Death Immortal skeleton said that there were sword immortals on the White Bone Path before he died. Could these 2 swordsmen be sword immortals? That big guy had barely enough strength when he was alive. Now that he's dead, his strength is at most 3 revolutions. It's not impossible for him to be killed by a powerful swordsman. However, what makes me curious is... The heroic-looking woman paused and looked at Jian Wushuang with interest. "Young man, did you create that sword principle?" Jian Wushuang thought for a while and nodded. "Yes. If you really created it yourself, your future achievements will be immeasurable," the heroic-looking woman said, then stretched out her palm and waved it in the air. In an instant, a painting scroll appeared in the originally chaotic void. Jian Wushuang's pupils constricted when he saw this. The painting was actually the battle between him and the skeleton of the Death Immortal. In the painting, the celestial river was flowing. The Death Immortal skeleton was finally penetrated by the celestial river and knelt on the White Bone Path. Jian Wushuang had never expected that the scene of their fight would be completely copied. This heroic woman was no ordinary swordsman. When the scroll finally dissipated, the middle-aged man looked at Jian Wushuang with a bright light in his eyes. "He's indeed very strong. I've taken a fancy to this junior. Come, come, come. Junior, fight with me for 3 rounds. I haven't seen such a good candidate in a long time." The corner of Jian Wushuang's eyes twitched slightly. He looked at the middle-aged man who was extremely excited and said, "I'm afraid I can't. I've entered this place by mistake and I need to leave as soon as possible. If I consume too much energy, I'm afraid I'll be in a passive position on the way. When the middle-aged man heard this, he raised his eyebrows and said, So you're in a hurry? That's even easier. If you can last 3 rounds under my hands, we'll let you leave in one piece. If you avoid fighting, I'm afraid it'll be hard to say. As he spoke, he patted the 6 swords at his waist. Jian Wushuang felt a headache coming on. He could feel that the 2 hidden sword companions were definitely more terrifying than they appeared. It was not an easy task to last 3 rounds. What do you think? The middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and revealed a meaningful smile. After thinking for a while, Jian Wushuang replied, Come on then. I'll make it clear that you'll let me go as long as I can last 3 rounds. Delightful! The middle-aged man laughed and flew to Jian Wushuang. The hem of his black and gold robe fluttered in the wind. His right hand was pressed on the hilts of the 6 long swords at his waist, and he was indescribably wanton. Jian Wushuang did not hesitate and formed an invisible sword in his palm. The middle-aged man's eyes lit up when he saw this. Shapeless and intangible, using the sword Dao as a sword. Junior, you're very bold. He continued, I don't dare to claim such praise. My sword was destroyed, so I have no choice but to do this. The Tarot Divine Sword was destroyed by Ding Beichun, which was the fundamental reason why Jian Wushuang had condensed the invisible sword. The middle-aged man smiled and nodded. My name is Yan Fan. That woman is my wife, Zhang Li. Jian Wushuang cupped his hands. Jian Wushuang. Wushuang's sword Dao. Sounds good, and has a meaning behind it. Let's begin. The entire battlefield of bones fell silent. The middle-aged man named Yan Fan did not seem to want to make the first move. He just looked at him with a smile. Jian Wushuang calmed himself down. He was not afraid of a pure competition of sword principles. What he was thinking about was how to draw the 3 moves in the next fight. In the next moment, Jian Wushuang moved like a thunderbolt. He swung his sword at an extremely fast speed and slashed at Yan Fan with his sharp blade. Even Grand Yen Immortals did not dare to underestimate this ordinary sword strike. But then a shocking scene appeared. Facing the sword, Yan Fan did not dodge or dodge. He stood still on the spot and raised his index and middle fingers of his right hand to catch the invisible sword that was slashing down. The invisible sword that was formed by the Wushuang sword Dao was caught by 2 fingers. Jian Wushuang's pupils constricted. He realized that the invisible sword could not advance any further. It's quite powerful, but it's too impetuous, and it's easy to see through its flaws, Yan Fan said with a smile and pushed him away. Jian Wushuang retreated a few feet. He was completely solemn. Yan Fan, who did not reveal anything at all, was like a towering divine mountain. No one could guess what he was going to do next. Yan Fan was still smiling. He put his right hand on the hilt of his sword and walked slowly to Jian Wushuang. Again. Jian Wushuang collected his thoughts and prepared to fight again. However, this time, he had just raised the invisible sword in his hand when he was hit head-on. Yan Fan's right hand, which was pressing on the hilt of his sword, suddenly raised and a long sword was unsheathed. With the hilt as the head, it carried an endless force and instantly smashed into Jian Wushuang's chest. Bang! Everything happened so fast that it was over before Jian Wushuang could react. He only felt that his chest was about to shatter, and his body retreated a few dozen feet before he could digest that huge force. The unsheathed sword returned to its sheath as if nothing had happened. Yan Fan still looked at Jian Wushuang with a smile. He was always calm. Rubbing his aching chest, Jian Wushuang gritted his teeth. He had been in a passive position during the 2 fights and was almost suppressed by Yan Fan. This made him depressed, but at the same time, he had a certain understanding of Yan Fan. From the day I started practicing the sword, I spent a whole Hua year just to unsheath the sword. During that 1 Hua year, I only tried my best to unsheath the sword as fast as possible so that I could have a slight advantage. Up until now, there hasn't been a single Yen Immortal who could block my unsheathing. Yan Fan blinked. How about it? Are you interested in learning swordsmanship from me? Hearing this, Jian Wushuang was shocked. It was simply unimaginable that he had practiced for an entire Hua year just to unsheath the sword, 1 Hua year was equivalent to 10 universe cycles. After 10 universe cycles, he had only repeated something that even a 3-year-old child could do. This kind of perseverance could not be described with any words. Even Jian Wushuang could not imagine how stubborn he was about the Tao of the sword. He had only cultivated for 10 million years, so he was sincerely impressed by this old monster who could cultivate for a Hua year. Facing Yan Fan's question, Jian Wushuang could only shake his head with a bitter smile. Then, he asked, "You are a sword immortal?" Hearing this, Yan Fan raised his eyebrows and smiled. "Of course, not only am I a sword immortal, but my wife is also a sword immortal. A pair of sword companions, 2 sword immortals." Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. When he learned that these 2 were real sword immortals, he knew why Yan Fan had made the Pact of 3 Swords moves. This was the meaning of stopping at a certain point. Once one stepped into the realm of sword immortals, one would basically be in existence at the peak. Ding Bai was the first sword immortal that Jian Wushuang knew. Zhang Li and Yan Fan were the other 2 sword immortals that he had met. There was a fundamental difference between a sword immortal and a swordsman. Jian Wushuang, who had not mastered the Wushuang sword doctrine, was not a sword immortal. "Junior, show me your true ability. Let me take a good look and see if the younger generation is formidable." Yan Fan patted the hilt of his sword and said loudly. At this moment, Jian Wushuang restrained his aura, and his entire body was like a true sword that was ready to be used. The northern wind blew gently, causing a ripple to appear in the void. In the next moment, he opened his eyes and a cold light shot out from them. Selfless true shadow integration. Wushuang sword Dao, Star River Lake Ocean sword intent. First move. Star. The sword slashed out without any fancy moves, causing the entire void to tremble. Yan Fan, who was still smiling, retracted his smile at this moment. His hand that was holding the hilt of his sword clenched tightly. The incomparably violent star-style sword intent shattered the void and devoured everything in front of it. The void along the way exploded into pillars of light. This sword intent was too grand and magnificent, as if the world was being devoured. Faced with this move, Yan Fan quietly drew a snowflake longsword from the 6 longswords at his waist. Then, he held the sword with both hands and cut a cross in front of his eyes. The void was shattered. In the next moment, the violent star-style sword intent was cut into a cross, turning into 4 raging rivers that exploded in the void. Yan Fan, who was in the middle, was completely unharmed. Even the corner of his clothes was not torn. The violent sword intent wind blew his hair. Other than that, there was no other fluctuation. When the sword intent completely dissipated, Jian Wushuang could not help but smile bitterly when he saw Yan Fan unharmed. Could it be that even the Wushuang sword Dao could not affect him at all? Yan Fan drew his sword and sheathed it again. He smiled at Jian Wushuang. "If my guess is correct, this sword move is the beginning of the previous sword move." Jian Wushuang nodded. He was terrifying enough to be able to guess the connection between the sword intents. Yan Fan continued, "Not bad. It's the first time I've seen such power as the beginning of a sword principle. You passed the first move. The next 2 moves will depend on your luck," he said. At this moment, the aura that was overflowing from his body was completely restrained. The snowflake sword that he had sheathed was pulled out again, and the tip of the sword that emitted a cold light was pointed at Jian Wushuang. A sense of great danger surged from the bottom of his heart. He did not think and directly raised his invisible sword to deal with it. At this moment, the originally somewhat broken void silently reflected an endless cold light. The ripple-like sword screen covered the entire void. This was the true sword of a sword immortal. This sword had killed the army of 100,000 death immortals. Countless swords formed an endless sword screen. If this move was completely executed, Jian Wushuang would definitely be severely injured. Jian Wushuang's divine thoughts spun rapidly in the face of the sword screen. When the sword curtain fell, the void could not withstand the surging sword intent and shattered. The heroic woman who was watching from afar, Zhang Li, had a serious look on her face. Her hand was on the hilt of her sword as if she was ready to help. Although she admired Jian Wushuang's amazing performance, Zhang Li did not think that Jian Wushuang could take the attack alone. As a sword companion, she was absolutely convinced of how terrifying Yan Fan's sword strike was. Therefore, Zhang Li was ready to help Jian Wushuang at any time. The void was bright, and the sword curtain fell. The boundless sword intent was enough to easily destroy the heavenly Tao. Jian Wushuang, who was in the center, suddenly opened his eyes as he faced the endless sword curtain. A green sword intent that was completely different from the previous Wushuang sword Tao rose from under his feet. If the Wushuang sword Tao represented magnificence and peerless will, then the green sword intent represented vitality, rebirth, and tenacity. Even Yan Fan was confused. He could feel that this sword intent was completely different from Jian Wushuang's sword principle. It was a brand new sword intent. Could it be that this junior has comprehended another type of sword Tao? No one answered him. At this moment, Jian Wushuang was completely enveloped by the green sword intent. The grass and leaves also rotated along with it, soft and tough. Even his pupils had a lush green color. Flowing cloud grass sword style. The 8th move. Cutting the 4 seasons. When the sword principle reached its peak, anything could be used as a sword. A straw grass or a willow branch was enough to release sword intent. Boundless sword intent turned into green leaves and leaves that rose up into the sky, as if spring was coming. The entire flowing cloud grass sword style, the first 6 moves were called simple, and the last 3 forms were called complex. It was in line with the principle of the great Tao becoming simple and from simple to complex. The cutting the 4 seasons was also the most terrifying sword move of the entire flowing cloud grass sword style. You can see the great path in the small world. Boundless verdant grass transformed into a 30,000-meter-long sword, standing tall in the sword curtain that was pressing down. The two collided, creating the most terrifying scene. The grass sword formed by the green sword intent began to shatter under the pressure of the sword curtain. The sword curtain collapsed and the grass sword shattered, causing the entire battlefield of bones to tremble. Looking at the grass sword that was about to shatter, Jian Wushuang's calm face did not change at all. It was as if he was not worried at all. Zhang Li also rushed over at this moment. She looked anxious and was ready to stop the tragedy. At the same time, she looked angry. She looked at Yan Fan and could not help but reprimand him. "You brat, don't you know how to restrain yourself?" At this moment, Yan Fan ignored Zhang Li's reproach and looked at what was happening in the sword screen. After a long while, he said with uncertainty, "This junior seems to have broken my sword strike." "What?" Zhang Li was about to stop the tragedy when he heard that. He stopped in the air and turned around. "What did you say?" "This junior seems to be able to break my sword strike." As if to confirm his thoughts, the grass sword that was originally shattered and about to collapse actually stopped shattering and began to rapidly condense. In the next moment, the grass sword that had almost collapsed reappeared. Its sword intent was even more vigorous, and it was filled with a tenacious and majestic force. At the same time, it stabbed at the sword screen that filled the sky again. Rumble! It was as if the heavenly Tao had collapsed, the earth had collapsed, and everything had fallen into destruction. This was the final collision of the two powerful sword intents, so much so that even the Yen power was overshadowed at this moment. The explosion that was so intense that it could destroy the white bone path lasted for a long time. When the endless sword screen was completely shattered and the incomparably green sword intent dissipated, a black-robed figure slowly walked out on the broken path. Jian Wushuang's face was still calm, but there was a hint of redness at the corner of his mouth. Although he had calculated everything that could happen, he was still injured. Fortunately, he had made the right bet. The flowing cloud grass sword style was not as exquisite, magnificent, and unparalleled as the Wushuang sword Tao. However, at this moment, he had successfully helped Jian Wushuang win this move. The corners of Jian Wushuang's mouth curled up slightly. The injuries he suffered in this competition were almost negligible. And all of this was because he had used the flowing cloud grass sword style. If Jian Wushuang had used the Wushuang sword Tao, he would have been able to take Yan Fan's full-powered sword attack head-on, but he would have to pay a heavy price. This was because this was the sword of a sword immortal. Jian Wushuang did not want to suffer a heavy price because he would be doomed if he suffered any losses in the following Whitebone path. Therefore, Jian Wushuang did not choose to take it head-on. Instead, he used the flowing cloud grass sword style to deal with it. The sword style of the flowing cloud grass sword, from simple to complex, meant tenacity and rebirth. This was enough for him to face it with the least amount of loss. Fortunately, he succeeded. Walking out of the center of the explosion, Jian Wushuang, who was unscathed and his robe was not even stained with dust, came to Zhongli and Yan Fan calmly. The sword companions, the sword immortals, they finally recovered from their shock. They looked at each other and then at Jian Wushuang. To be able to take a sword immortal's attack head-on with the strength of a swordsman was something that would not be convincing to the Yan immortals in any heavenly region. But this scene actually happened. Taking a deep breath, Yan Fan said, "Young man, your performance has exceeded our expectations. I'm afraid that in less than a Hua year, even if your sword principle stagnates, you will be able to reach the realm of sword immortal." Jian Wushuang cupped his hands and said, "Senior, you flatter me. To cultivate the sword, one must focus on one's own luck. There's still one last sword move. If I win, can you two seniors let me go?" Zhongli and Yan Fan looked at each other and then said, "Are we that scary that you don't want to stay? You guys are still considered approachable." Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. "But I really have something important to do. I need to leave this place as soon as possible. If that's the case, if I continue to obstruct you, it will seem like I'm not free and easy." Yan Fan smiled. "This last sword fight is meaningless. You've already proved it to me." Hearing this, Jian Wushuang was secretly delighted. It was undoubtedly the best situation for him to walk out of the sword immortal's hands almost unscathed. "Then this junior will thank you here." Yan Fan nodded with a smile. He glanced at Zhongli, then quickly walked to Jian Wushuang and put his arm around his shoulder. This action made Jian Wushuang a little confused. Looking at Yan Fan's malicious face, he felt a chill run down his spine. "Senior, this is—" "Cough cough, junior." "No, little brother Jian. Do you want to take me as your master?" Yan Fan cleared his throat and looked at him with anticipation and enthusiasm. Jian Wushuang did not know whether to laugh or cry. He said, "Senior, I already have a master. I'm afraid I can't." Yan Fan did not expect this answer. He was a little anxious. "Little brother, you have to know that you can't just recognize your master randomly. You have to find the one who matches you the most. That's the best." As he said this, he patted his chest. "Little brother, as long as you acknowledge me as your master's wife and I will pass on our lifetime's worth of comprehension to you. Think about it." The two sword immortals had offered such a tempting condition, which was enough to make any swordsman in the heavenly region go crazy. However, Jian Wushuang still shook his head. "Senior, I have a master. I really can't." Yan Fan was speechless. He had never expected that he would not be able to become someone's master even if he wanted to. At this moment, Zhongli appeared behind him and slapped him away. "Old man, how many years have passed? But you're still so generous. Go away, kid." Zhongli shouted angrily and then looked at Jian Wushuang. "We'll meet again if we're fated to." Jian Wushuang cupped his hands and said, "Thank you." Just as he was about to turn around and leave, Yan Fan's voice rang out again. "Wait a minute." Jian Wushuang stopped and looked helplessly at Yan Fan, who had caught up with him. Before he could react, Yan Fan held his right hand and quickly tapped his wrist with his index and middle fingers. Then, a true sword imprint the size of an index finger was imprinted on his wrist. Jian Wushuang hurriedly withdrew his wrist and tried to force out the mark with his yen power. "There's no need to waste your effort, little brother. This mark doesn't harm you in any way. It's my sword intent that can sense where you are. If you're in danger, your master's wife and I will save you at the first moment." Before he finished, he was slapped again. Zhongli put one hand on her waist and was furious. What a disrespectful fellow. He's simply a sword immortal in vain. Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. It was unbelievable that he could get two masters for free even though he had refused to obey. After silently sympathizing with Yen Fan, who had been beaten up, he solemnly bid farewell to the two sword immortals and continued to head toward the end of the white bone path. Yen Fan, who had been dejected, was instantly energized after Jian Wushuang left. He ran to Zhongli excitedly and said, "How is it? How is our disciple?" Zhongli rolled her eyes and said nothing. After Jian Wushuang left, she started to talk. "I can't see through his future either, but I can be sure of one thing now. The realm of Sword Immortal won't be his end, but his starting point." Yen Fan took a deep breath when he heard that. "Then it seems like we didn't take this disciple in vain." "What do you mean your disciple? Didn't you see that he had already decisively rejected you?" Zhongli rolled her eyes at him again. He smiled embarrassedly and scratched his head. "So what? If you want to be a master, you have to be thick-skinned. It's very necessary to pester him. I've already left a mark on him. Do you think he can escape from us?" Zhongli looked at Yen Fan and then at the endless void. "I'm afraid this is the limit of our lives. Instead of sleeping in this blood sea, why don't we leave and pass on our swordsmanship to that little guy so that we can be relieved of the burden our master gave us?" Yen Fan nodded and stretched. "Indeed, after staying under the sea of blood for too long, my bones are about to rust. It's time to do some serious business. Our sword Dao will not be buried if we pass it on to that kid. Perhaps he will reach another realm. So, we can't let this little guy go." Jian Wushuang let out a long sigh after he left the two sword immortals and traveled for another 1,000 miles. The pressure that the sword immortals gave him was too great. If those two sword immortals were determined not to let him leave, then there was no way he could escape. Raising his right hand and looking at the sword-shaped mark on his wrist, Jian Wushuang shook his head helplessly. He collected his thoughts and continued forward. The path of bones under his feet seemed to be endless. Although he had experienced many hardships, he still could not see the end. This made Jian Wushuang feel a little depressed. If he continued to waste time like this, he was afraid that he would sink into the endless sea before Di Qing could be found. No matter what happened next, he had to leave this place as soon as possible, leave the so-called heavenly continent, and find Di Qing. With his sword intent protecting his body, Jian Wushuang dashed forward and traveled 1,000,000 miles in an instant. As he continued to move forward, he began to notice that the further he went, the less restless the aura became. All the immortal aura had dissipated, and even the immortal bones could not become dead immortals. It was extremely quiet. At the same time, a pure and dense energy was flowing. Jian Wushuang was shocked. He had never expected that such a dense yen power would be formed under the blood river. At the same time, this made him raise his guard. The following changes on the white bone path also made him wary. The originally flat white bone path paved by the remains of the yen immortals began to curve as they continued forward, like a staircase going up. Jian Wushuang stopped and looked at the white bone path in front of him with a serious expression. The white bone path leading to the heavens was covered with a layer of faint energy that extended into the endless void. At the end of the dark clouds there was a very vague outline. He muttered in his heart. The scene before him seemed to be somewhat similar to the heavenly palace on the heavenly continent. If there were other branches on the white bone path, Jian Wushuang would not have bothered to continue. But now there was only one white bone path, so he had to continue. Taking a deep breath, Jian Wushuang stepped on the stairway to heaven. When his feet landed on the first step, an invisible pressure pressed down on him. The pressure was formless and substantial, as if it was some kind of law that directly pressed down. Jian Wushuang did not hesitate. He flew forward and in an instant, he had crossed 10,000 steps. After 10,000 steps, Jian Wushuang stopped. There were beads of sweat on his temples. The pressure on the stairway to heaven was far more terrifying than he had imagined. Moreover, after reaching a certain level, the pressure would multiply. 10,000 steps forced Jian Wushuang to stop. It was as if there were millions of divine mountains pressing down on him. Looking at the endless road ahead, he gritted his teeth and continued forward. This time, his speed was much slower. 10,000 steps, 30,000 steps, 50,000 steps, 70,000 steps. At this moment, Jian Wushuang was struggling to move forward. The yen power in his meridians had been circulated to the extreme. Every pore on his body was evaporating a large amount of sweat. 80,000 steps. Selfless true shadow was forced out. With the help of the selfless true shadow, Jian Wushuang felt relaxed and could move forward quickly again. When he reached the 90,000 steps, the huge palace that was originally wrapped in black smoke finally appeared. It was a majestic heavenly palace built in the sky, filled with an endless cold aura. Jian Wushuang had an inexplicable intuition that this palace was most likely an imperial palace that had been left behind since the ancient era. A heavenly court. Could this be the ruins of the former heavenly court? At the thought of this, Jian Wushuang thought of the former heavenly court of Emperor Luya. In the past, the heavenly court meant that opportunities and great dangers coexisted. However, he had no interest in exploring this heavenly court. After all, even if the emperor was angry, it was a pressure that he could not withstand. However, Jian Wushuang had no way to escape. He could only brace himself and go to the former heavenly court. The last 10,000 steps were almost a combination of the first 90,000 steps. All the pressure was unprecedented. Jian Wushuang almost could not hold on even with the selfless true shadow. He did not even dare to take a breath for fear that he would be crushed into powder by the terrifying pressure. 95,000 steps. 96,000 steps. 99,000 steps. At this point, Jian Wushuang's three great Daos were all suppressed. The Wushuang Sword Dao, the Dao of Protection, the Slaughter Dao. Only with the addition of three great Daos could he move forward. 99,900 steps. When he reached the last step, he was already an arrow at the end of its flight. At this moment, sweat no longer flowed out of every pore, but dark red divine blood. The divine blood dripped down his robe in front of the celestial heavens and was quickly absorbed. Jian Wushuang's hands trembled as he took out an emperor-grade pill and stuffed it into his mouth. Only then did his injuries stop. Some of the shattered parts of the undying and imperishable immortal body quickly recovered. Jian Wushuang slowly exhaled a mouthful of turbid breath. He felt relaxed and the fatigue from before disappeared. He subconsciously looked behind him and was surprised to find that the white bone path had completely disappeared. It was as if it had never existed. There was only an endless void behind it. Taking a deep breath, Jian Wushuang turned around and walked into the boundless and majestic heavenly court. Who dares to trespass into the heavenly court? Outside the heavenly court, a voice echoed in the void in front of the silent giant door. As this majestic voice resounded, two grand yen immortals holding heavenly halberds tore through the void and walked out. Both of them were 3 revolutions grand yen immortals. Jian Wushuang became alert and formed an invisible sword in his palm. Those who trespass the heavenly court with swords will die. The 2 grand yen immortals holding the heavenly halberd shouted out, their eyes emitting a cold light. In fact, Jian Wushuang was still helpless against both 3 revolutions grand yen immortals. However, he could not avoid them now. He could only fight. The 2 halberds crossed and instantly shot out an unparalleled light. These 2 gatekeepers of the heavenly courts did not even ask for the reason and directly attacked. Jian Wushuang had no choice but to respond. With a slash of his sword, 36,000 sword intents rose up and all of them slashed forward. Having comprehended his strongest sword intent, Jian Wushuang's control of sword principle and sword intent had reached an unprecedented level. It was not just the sword Dao, but the ancestral skills and immortal styles were also one step closer. If it was not for the lack of immortal source, Jian Wushuang was confident that he would have reached the Grand Yen immortal realm after the battle with the immortal lord of the 9 heavens Chong Duoling. However, there were no ifs. The current him was still at the peak of the Yen immortal stage. However, this Yen immortal had the terrifying strength to kill a Grand Yen immortal. Faced with the cold light that shot over, the 36,000 sword intents attacked from all directions. Rumble! In front of heavenly court, the most magnificent explosion occurred. The 2 gatekeepers of the heavenly courts retreated in unison, their eyes becoming cautious and solemn. Jian Wushuang raised his long sword and stood still. He did not pursue the victory. I have no intention of entering the heavenly court, but this is the only way out. If you can tell me the other way out, I will definitely leave. Hearing this, the two gatekeepers looked at each other, and the killing intent in their eyes disappeared. In the end, an elderly Grand Yen Immortal stepped forward and said in a deep voice, "Go back first. Don't disturb the Emperor's sleep. Once he wakes up, no one can save you. I don't mean to disturb you, but I'm afraid this is the only way I can leave, so I can't retreat." Jian Wushuang did not retreat and said in a serious voice, "How dare you, a mere Yen Immortal like you, dare to be so arrogant? Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you on the spot?" The gatekeeper took another step forward, and the hand holding the heavenly halberd seemed to be about to kill in the next moment. He remained standing at the same spot and said calmly, "You can't kill me. How arrogant!" The gatekeeper was so angry that he laughed. The halberd in his hand was about to hit Jian Wushuang. However, at this moment, something unexpected happened. The heavenly halberd that was lifted up high was placed horizontally above Jian Wushuang's head. It was unable to advance any further, as if it was bound by some invisible heavenly Tao. Even if his face was flushed red, he could not take another step forward. Jian Wushuang felt strange. He did not release any yen power or sword intent to block the gatekeeper. However, the gatekeeper did not seem to be faking it. He was really being restrained. In the next moment, the huge gate of the heavenly courts that seemed to have been silent for countless years slowly opened, reflecting endless light. The expressions of the two gatekeepers changed drastically. Without thinking, they knelt heavily in front of the heavenly court on the spot, not even daring to raise their heads. The light dissipated in an instant, and everything returned to normal. "Come in." A deep and ethereal voice that was above the heavenly Tao resounded from the heavenly court. Jian Wushuang's heart skipped a beat. A living emperor? He was in disbelief. Could it be that an emperor had really been sealed in the endless sea? Suppressing his restless divine thoughts, Jian Wushuang finally decided to enter the heavenly court. He had already made up his mind. If the emperor did not intend to let him go, he would at most die. At least he could be reborn in the future. Stepping into the heavenly courts, the warm jade ground beneath his feet lit up quietly, illuminating the entire heavenly court. The heavenly court was vast and vast. There were no pillars of mountains and seas, no tables to sit on, only emptiness. Jian Wushuang felt a chill down his spine as he stood in the heavenly court. "You're here?" The ethereal voice resounded in the heavenly courts, and he was unable to tell where it came from. "You are the first guest I have seen since I fell into a deep slumber, and I had long predicted this day to come a few years ago." As the voice fell, a figure in an emperor's robe slowly walked out from the depths of the heavenly courts. An indescribable heavenly Tao aura circulated around his body, making people dare not look at him directly. Jian Wushuang's pupils constricted as if he had seen something unbelievable. The figure of the imperial emperor in the imperial robe looked exactly the same as Jian Wuyang. Whether it was his appearance, figure, or the aura flowing around his body, he was exactly the same as Jian Wuyang. It was as if he was carved from the same mold. "Do you find me very familiar? Exactly like the emperor in your heart?" The emperor came to Jian Wushuang slowly and said calmly. Jian Wushuang was shocked and said solemnly, "Do you know what I'm thinking? Of course, you can't hide anything I want to know." He continued to speak. His pair of true eyes seemed to be able to see through Jian Wushuang completely. Jian Wushuang could not help but panic. If what he said was true, it would be too terrifying. The emperor continued, "I predicted this many years ago. What I didn't expect was that it would be an insignificant Yen Immortal." "You've been to the heavenly court?" Jian Wushuang pondered for a moment and finally nodded. "Yes." "Have you seen Jian Wuyang?" "Yes, I have." "Do you think that I'm a little similar to him?" Jian Wushuang nodded again and muttered in his heart, "It's not just a little similar. It's exactly the same. I also know that I look exactly like Jian Wuyang." "Do you want to know why?" The emperor smiled. Although his face was no longer young, one could still see his endless heroism. He seemed to be lost in his memories as he looked into the distance with his true eyes. His name is Jin Wuyang, and my name is Jin Wu. However, in the myriad heavenly regions, only Emperor Jin Wuyang is known, not Emperor Jin Wu. In other words, I am him and he is me. Jian Wushuang was completely shocked when he heard that. An emperor could actually separate into two different individuals? Then which one of them was real and which one was fake? There's no truth between us. We're just two different images. His name was Emperor Jin Wu, and he spoke slowly to answer Jian Wushuang's doubts. Emperor Jin Wu looked at him. Jin Wuyang is one side, and I am the other. Jian Wushuang did not know how to describe this relationship. As the supreme emperor of the entire Great Sea region, Jin Wuyang had actually sealed another self in the Endless Sea. This was truly inconceivable. And why did Jin Wuyang seal him in the Endless Sea? As if he could read Jian Wushuang's mind, Emperor Jin Wu said slowly, "The only reason why he sealed me here is that he can't control me or destroy me. He can only seal me here forever. I am his other side, and I possess a power that is even deeper than his." Faced with a version of him that he cannot control and cannot destroy, he made this move. I, who was sleeping here, wanted to leave at all times. I had already deduced your appearance before I was sealed, so you should know what to do. Hearing this, Jian Wushuang took a few steps back and his eyes flashed with vigilance. Take me out of here and in exchange I'll let you go. How about it? Emperor Jin Wu slowly approached him. Jian Wushuang thought quickly and said, I'm afraid not. I can't even protect myself now. It's unrealistic to leave this place completely. Emperor Jin Wu seemed to be able to easily see through his soul. He then said with a faint smile, You were not banished here by Jin Wuyang. You came here voluntarily. A Yen immortal who came here voluntarily and survived until now will definitely have a way to get out. Jian Wushuang felt a headache coming on. I'm afraid it'll depend on the will of the heavens whether I can get out. Emperor Jin Wu smiled and pointed at Jian Wushuang's chest. You have Emperor Jin Wuyang's aura. Stunned, he reached into his pocket and took out a ring that was made of gold and jade. Why do you have Jin Wuyang's ring? Did he give it to you? Emperor Jin Wu said seriously. Jian Wushuang said, Well, he didn't give it to me. Someone else gave it to me. Emperor Jin Wu did not probe further. His eyes were solemn. Open the ring. Jian Wushuang had no choice but to do as he was told. When he opened the ring, it did not cause any abnormal movements. He let out a sigh of relief and said, I'll be sleeping in this ring later. When I leave the Endless Sea, you can release me. At that time, your mission will be completed. Jian Wushuang felt helpless, but he could only do as he was told. After all, if he did not agree, the consequences would be obvious. He could only blame himself for being too weak. He could not even escape from an emperor. After saying that, Emperor Jin Wu's true body turned into a wisp of smoke and entered Jian Wushuang's ring. After seeing the ring in his hand emit a strange color, Jian Wushuang did not relax. Instead, his mood became heavier. In his opinion, Emperor Jin Wu was not as harmless as he appeared to be. Instead, what he did not say was the most important thing. If he were to explain and take him away from the Endless Sea, the entire Great Sea region would probably fall into an unpredictable situation. At the thought of this, Jian Wushuang hurriedly stopped his thoughts because he suddenly remembered that Emperor Jin Wu could guess what he was thinking. At this moment, Emperor Jin Wu's faint voice sounded from the ring again. Right after you leave this place, remember not to return to the heavenly continent. Leave this place directly and don't be discovered by them. After saying this, Emperor Jin Wu's voice disappeared completely. As the Emperor's aura was concealed, the entire heavenly court supported by the Imperial Emperor's aura began to enter an irreversible collapse. Emperor! Emperor! Heavenly court's door opened, and the two grand Yen immortals who were guarding the door rushed into heavenly court in panic. Their emperor had long disappeared, so how could they find him? Jian Wushuang stood rooted to the ground and watched as the immortal bodies of the two guarding Grand Evolution immortals shattered continuously. In the end, they were destroyed in the endless dust along with the entire heavenly court. With the fall of the heavenly court, the white bone path had long disappeared. Even the blood river hanging above his head began to fluctuate violently at this moment. Jian Wushuang stood in the void and looked ahead. In front of the shattered heavenly court, a huge door that seemed to have been sealed for countless years appeared at this moment. Without any hesitation, Jian Wushuang leaped forward. He had already stayed in the myriad immortal blood river for a while, and he could not stay any longer. A majestic energy shot out from his palm and smashed heavily on the giant door. Rumble! At this moment, the entire domain of the myriad immortal blood river fell into chaos. The giant gate slowly opened, and countless lights shone out from behind the gate. Jian Wushuang entered the giant door without hesitation. As the radiance dissipated, the hazy and ethereal aura under the blood river disappeared, replaced by the desolate aura of the endless sea. "I'm out." Looking at the grayish-white land around him, Jian Wushuang let out a long sigh. At this moment, he should still be in the heavenly continent, but he had completely left the heaven palace in the center. He recalled the last words of Emperor Zhenwu. After thinking for a while, he decided to leave the heavenly region. However, Jian Wushuang did not expect to hear dozens of air-breaking sounds behind him. In the next moment, dozens of black-robed envoys completely surrounded him from all directions. At a rough glance, there were no less than 50 black-robed envoys, and each of them was at least at the 3 revolution stage. This undoubtedly gave Jian Wushuang great pressure. The two sides were in a state of confrontation. Finally, a black-robed envoy slowly stepped forward and cupped his hands. "Your Highness has invited you. Please move to the heavenly palace." "What if I say no?" He raised his eyebrows and said coldly. The black-robed emissary was stunned. Apparently, he did not expect Jian Wushuang to say that. "Since that's the case, don't blame us for being rude," the black-robed envoy said coldly. In an instant, the 50-odd black-robed envoys attacked without holding back. Streams of yen power interweaved and formed an inescapable net that surrounded Jian Wushuang. Looking at the layers of the yen power net around him, Jian Wushuang was furious. He had no contact with the princes of this continent, but he was dragged into this mess for no reason. He was dragged into the blood river, where he had almost died. He had gone through many hardships before he was able to get out. How could he not be angry? With the combined might of 53 revolutions grand yen immortals, the inescapable net released was unprecedentedly powerful. At this moment, the heavenly continent plane below him began to tremble as if it could shatter at any time. Jian Wushuang was trapped in this inescapable net, and there was no possibility of escaping. He had no intention of escaping, and a bloodthirsty scarlet appeared in the depths of his deep pupils. A thick chain of inescapable nets instantly wrapped around him, and a terrifying power spread out. The arm-thick lightning snakes surged and quickly consumed the yen power of Jian Wushuang's immortal body. The leader of the black-robed envoys saw that he had been bound and hurriedly shouted, "Take him away!" In an instant, more than 50 black-robed envoys moved. Each of them had a derivation chain in their hands, ready to dash forward. However, something unexpected happened. The combined power of 50 grand yen immortals failed to drag Jian Wushuang. He stood still, like a terrifying divine mountain that covered the sky and earth. Even if dozens of energy chains left deep marks on his immortal body, they could not drag him away. The black-robed emissaries who saw this scene were shocked. One had to know that this was the power of more than 50 grand yen immortals. They could not even control a puny little yen immortal. "Rise for me!" The leader of the black-robed envoys shouted angrily. The energy chain in his hand was almost tightened into a straight line. The rest of the black-robed envoys followed suit and tightened the chains. If this strange scene was seen by outsiders, they would definitely be incomparably shocked. The situation that was originally without suspense had actually fallen into a contest of strength. Jian Wushuang did not move an inch, even though the chains on his immortal body were stretched to the limit. Strands of scarlet light came out of his body. The slaughter Tao had already covered his body. At this moment, the mystic garb of the 9 heavens also emitted a sky-blue light, protecting his immortal body from any damage. With the selfless shadow and the slaughter Dao on him, Jian Wushuang was completely enraged. He raised his arms and smashed down fiercely at the chains around him. Boom! An extremely dull sound rang out as nearly 20 chains were shattered by this attack. More than 20 black-robed envoys quickly retreated 1,000 feet. Jian Wushuang's body became lighter. He continued to swing his arms like this and smashed all the remaining yen power chains that were wrapped around his immortal body. All the black-robed envoys retreated 1,000 feet and then attacked again. Jian Wushuang, whose eyes were stained with blood qi, directly met the attack. While taking into account his strength, his figure was like a ghost, making it impossible for the black-robed envoys to figure him out. The black-robed envoys who rushed forward first felt a bloody shadow flash in front of them. Then, without any warning, they all spat out a mouthful of sticky divine blood. Their chests had all caved in at this moment, almost shattering. Jian Wushuang threw dozens of punches at an unimaginable speed. Each of the black-robed envoys who rushed forward suffered at least 2 punches, and their immortal bodies were almost shattered. After repelling several black-robed envoys in an instant, Jian Wushuang suddenly condensed an invisible sword and slashed down heavily. Wushuang Sword Dao, Star River Lake Ocean Sword Intent. First move. Star. Clang. An incomparably clear sword hum erupted with a huge brilliance at this moment. The entire sky within a radius of 100,000 miles trembled under this sword strike. A sword slashed out, causing the momentum emitted by the Grand Yen Immortal to dim down. Bang! Millions of sword intents exploded, tearing apart a large part of the sky along the way. Then, thousands of light pillars exploded in the middle of the black-robed emissary. With the selfless true shadow and the slaughter Dao, Jian Wushuang rarely used sword principle because the uncontrollable factors were too much of a burden. The Star River Lake Ocean Sword Intent almost instantly consumed more than half of the yen power that supported his immortal body. At the same time, cracks appeared on the undying and imperishable immortal body. Jian Wushuang's right arm, which was holding the sword, had started to crack and was dripping with divine blood. The selfless Tour Shadow and the Slaughter Dao consumed too much yen power. As a result, Jian Wushuang had to rely on the power of the Emperor-grade pill after releasing the first sword intent. He quickly stuffed several pills into his mouth and quickly recovered. Under this sword, a hole was forcefully cut open in the encirclement. Several black-robed envoys could not dodge in time, and their immortal sources were destroyed, resulting in tragic deaths. The power of a single sword strike was so terrifying. However, this sword did not destroy the faith of these black-robed envoys. After a moment, they charged forward again like crazy. At this moment, all kinds of magnificent and dazzling immortal styles and supreme treasures were thrown at Jian Wushuang. For a moment, the world was filled with magnificence. Even if Jian Wushuang could fight 10 people alone, he could only choose to fight against the various immortal moves and supreme treasures. Different sizes of explosions exploded at this moment. The full-strength attack of more than 40 grand yen immortals was too terrifying. As Jian Wushuang's figure dissipated, the continent plate was shattered for 1,000,000 miles. What was certain was that if they went all out, the heavenly continent plane formed by the remains of the yen immortal would definitely collapse. Looking at the center of the huge explosion that had turned the sky into dust and ashes, all the black-robed envoys unconsciously heaved a sigh of relief. This guy was merely a yen immortal. The pressure he gave them was too terrifying. With a wave of his hand, he could severely injure or even kill a 3 revolutions grand yen immortal. What kind of terrifying strength was this? Fortunately, he had fallen. All the black-robed envoys were certain that no yen immortal could survive this attack. As the sky fell, the leader of the black-robed envoys did not relax. His gaze was still solemn. He had an unimaginable premonition that Jian Wushuang would not die. As if to confirm his thoughts, when the unparalleled explosion dissipated and all the black-robed envoys withdrew their treasures, a figure that was still standing in the void appeared. At this moment, all the black-robed envoys subconsciously took a step back in horror. Cough, cough. A large mouthful of divine blood spurted out of his mouth and then scattered into the sky. At this moment, his aura was extremely dispirited. The selfless true shadow and the slaughter Dao were all shattered. Even though it was Jian Wushuang's strongest trump card, it could not hold on and was shattered by the attacks of more than 40 black-robed envoys. If it wasn't for the protection of the mystic garb of the 9 heavens, even the undying immortal body would have shattered and died on the spot. The mystic garb was as thin as a cicada's wing and was still emitting a brilliant blue light. It was not injured at all under this terrifying impact and was still intact. Jian Wushuang's immortal body was on the verge of destruction. If he used his yen power forcefully, his meridians would be damaged unpredictably. Fortunately, there were still a few emperor-grade pills in his mouth. He directly chewed and swallowed them. However, Jian Wushuang was no longer able to fight when his immortal body was on the verge of destruction. The black-robed envoys, who were originally extremely shocked, heaved a sigh of relief again after vaguely sensing that he did not have the strength to fight. The black-robed emissary's ashen face finally eased up. However, he still did not dare to relax. He released a yen power chain and bound Jian Wushuang. The rest of the black-robed envoys also released their own energy chains, directly wrapping up his entire body before giving up. From this, it could be seen how much they feared Jian Wushuang. Jian Wushuang, whose entire body was tied up and only his head was exposed, panted slightly and allowed himself to be dragged forward. His eyes were tightly shut. Clearly, he was quickly repairing his broken immortal body. In this battle, they lost more than 10 black-robed envoys before they managed to take him down. The black-robed envoy at the front was ashen. If he didn't have to take Jian Wushuang back to the heavenly palace of the imperial city, he would have crushed Jian Wushuang into powder on the spot. At the same time, he was also shocked in his heart. What was the background of this puny little yen immortal? He could actually cross realms and kill a grand yen immortal. Not only that, he even walked out of the myriad immortal blood river. This was the extent that made him feel deeply terrified. One had to know that under that blood river, even if a grand yen immortal entered, they would lose their minds and would not be able to walk out. As the personal follower of the emperor, no one knew better than him what kind of terrifying existence was under the blood river. Just the endless army of death immortals alone was enough to devour any grand yen immortal, let alone those mysterious and unapproachable ancient almighties. One had to know that even Bian Ziyuan did not dare to easily step into the heavenly official of the prince. However, Jian Wushuang came out alive. Retracting the meaning in their hearts, more than 40 black-robed envoys tied Jian Wushuang up and rushed to the center of the entire heavenly continent, the imperial city's heavenly palace. When the imperial city shrouded in clouds appeared before their eyes, all the black-robed envoys heaved a sigh of relief. Their mission was completed. The imperial city's heavenly gate slowly opened. Then, they quickly entered as if nothing had happened. In the distant sky continent, where no one was paying attention, an old man looked at this scene in horror. He had an inexplicable intuition. It seemed like the heavens were about to change. After entering the imperial city and stepping onto the White Bone Road, the group of black-robed envoys sped forward. The huge door of the Heaven Palace had long been opened. Bian Ziyuan stood in front of the Heaven Palace with his arms crossed, as if he had been waiting for a long time. Great heavenly official, we lost another 12. The leading black-robed envoy took a step forward and said in a low voice. Bian Ziyuan nodded. I understand. You've done well. You may leave. The black-robed envoy agreed and left Jian Wushuang, who was tied up like a dumpling, in front of him. Bian Ziyuan immediately revealed a meaningful smile. You did well too. Congratulations. You survived. Jian Wushuang looked at him coldly without saying a word. Don't try to resist. You're just an arrow at the end of its flight. I can easily destroy you. After saying this last sentence, Bian Ziyuan stretched out his hand and beckoned. Then he carried him into the hall. The cold and withered hall was still the same as when they first met. However, the damaged mountain sea pillar had been repaired. A young man with a gloomy aura walked out slowly from the depths of the hall and came to Jian Wushuang with interest. I'm very curious about how you managed to walk out of there alive. Tell me what you saw and what you obtained under the blood river. Looking at the young man and the group of black-robed envoys, Jian Wushuang's face turned pale and he said weakly, "First, untie me, I'm out of strength." When the young man heard this, he pondered for a moment. Then, he looked at Bianziyuan and said, "Untie him, Your Highness?" Bianziyuan was a little unwilling, but seeing his persistence, he could only reach out and untie it. Layers of chains fell off and Jian Wushuang was free. "Can you say it now?" The young man took another step forward, seemingly very eager. All the joints in his body creaked slightly at this moment, as if he had woken up from a deep sleep. Bianziyuan, who was standing at the side, was shocked when he saw this scene. He realized something and hurriedly released the exquisite water mist. However, it was too late. Jian Wushuang, who had escaped, was no longer weak. An unimaginable power surged around him. An invisible sword formed in his right hand and stabbed at the young man in front of him at a speed that none of the black-robed envoys could react in time. As the distance was too close, he could only watch helplessly as a long sword surging with millions of sword intents pierced into his body. Time seemed to stop as a soft sound rang out. Then, 36,000 sword intents also surged into his body, directly causing unimaginable injuries. The sword intent tore apart the immortal body and completely exploded. After that, Bianziyuan released the exquisite mist toward Jian Wushuang. However, it was already too late. He had successfully escaped and retreated 1,000 feet in an instant. "You're courting death." Bianziyuan was furious. He had never thought that Jian Wushuang would be so arrogant that he would kill a prince in front of him. Jian Wushuang, who was standing with his sword, smiled wantonly. He did not put all the black-robed envoys and Bianziyuan in his eyes at all. After taking one last look at Bianziyuan, Jian Wushuang flew away. "Kill him on the spot. Anyone who kills this child will be given a position as a minor heavenly official." Bianziyuan was already furious to the extreme. All the black-robed envoys in the Heaven Palace rushed out when they heard this. Just the position of a minor heavenly official was enough to drive them crazy. The position of heavenly official that was attached to the aura of the emperor meant that they could enjoy the nourishment of the emperor's fate energy. This was an unimaginable fate that was enough to make them all go crazy. At this moment, the young man's immortal body was completely shattered, but he used a mysterious cell and condensed everything. He said hoarsely with a pale face, "Don't kill him. Leave him alive. Whether we can leave this place or not depends on him." Bianziyuan's expression was uncertain. In the end, he said fiercely, "Even if I let him live, I'll make him pay a price." Rumble. The huge door of Heaven Palace was opened by Jian Wushuang's sword. He stepped on the clouds and mist and cut off the white bone path for thousands of feet. Then he stood proudly in the void like a true sword immortal, unrestrained to the extreme. He did not seem to realize that he was running for his life. Instead, he was wandering around the universe. Jian Wushuang wanted to fight, not escape.